I never expected the river to call to me that night, yet something deep in my chest urged me forward, dragging me from the warmth of my small cottage and into the cold embrace of the forest that edged our town, the moonlight weaving silver threads through the blackness of the trees and reflecting in the water like shards of broken glass, the air carrying the scent of wet earth and wildflowers, sharp and sweet all at once, and as I stepped onto the soft moss, my heart beat harder than it had in years, a sense of anticipation mingling with unease, for the forest had always whispered secrets I couldn't hear fully, and yet I had felt its pull for as long as I could remember, a tingle along my spine and the faint impression that I was being watched, though I told myself it was only the wind brushing against the branches, the rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl masking any real threat, and I tried to focus on the gentle murmur of the river, flowing steadily as if it had secrets it was unwilling to share, a quiet lullaby that felt almost human in its rhythm, soothing yet strangely insistent, urging me closer to its banks, where the water shimmered like liquid silver under the moon's gaze, the reflection twisting with each small wave, and I was mesmerized, stepping lightly over gnarled roots and jagged stones, feeling the damp soil suck at my boots, the chill creeping into my bones until I hugged my coat tighter around me, the forest alive with noises both familiar and strange, every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves raising the hair along my arms, and I could not shake the feeling that someone was waiting for me just beyond the reach of the moonlight, a presence I could not name, neither threatening nor comforting, but powerful in a way that resonated in my chest and made my breath catch in my throat, and my thoughts turned to the dreams I had been having for weeks, vivid and unsettling, of golden eyes glinting in the dark, a low growl that echoed in the back of my mind, a feeling of being hunted and protected at the same time, and I tried to dismiss it as nothing more than imagination, yet the hair on my neck rose as if recognizing some distant truth, a memory I had never lived but somehow remembered, a sensation that whispered of destiny, of a life beyond the ordinary boundaries of my small world, and then I heard it, a sound so sharp it made me stumble, a frantic high-pitched yelp that sliced through the night and froze me in place, the river's gentle lullaby replaced by a desperate cry, raw and pleading, sending a chill down my spine as I strained to see into the shadows, my heart hammering as the hairs on my arms and neck stood on end, and instinct pushed me forward, deeper into the darkness where the yelp had come from, my feet moving of their own accord over roots and stones slick with rain, my hands shaking as I parted branches that seemed to clutch at my coat, and then I saw it, a small shape, struggling in the current, barely visible beneath the silvered surface, a tiny body tossed and battered by the river, limbs flailing, eyes wide with terror, and without thinking I leapt forward, plunging into the freezing water, the shock of it stealing my breath and causing my limbs to spasm, the river wrapping around me like icy fingers, pulling at me with a strength that seemed unnatural, and I fought against it, muscles straining, teeth chattering, heart racing in a rhythm I had never known, until I reached the struggling creature and wrapped my arms around it, feeling its trembling body press against mine, claws digging unintentionally into my skin, and I held on, kicking against the current, dragging us both toward the bank, lungs burning, ears ringing, and when we finally toppled onto the muddy ground, gasping and soaked, I looked down into the pup's terrified eyes and whispered words I barely believed myself, telling it was safe, even as my own heart continued to pound, and in that instant the forest seemed to grow silent, the only sound our shared breathing, the water still murmuring at the edges, and then I sensed him, the presence I had felt before, stronger now, almost tangible, moving through the shadows with a grace that made the earth itself seem to bend, watching me, studying me, golden eyes glinting in the moonlight like molten fire, and I froze, fear and awe battling within me, unable to look away from the intensity of his gaze, and though he had not spoken, I felt the weight of his claim, the power radiating from him like heat from a flame, a mixture of warning and invitation that made my chest tighten, and for the first time in my life, I realized that my ordinary world, the quiet life I had known, the safety I had clung to, had ended in that instant, replaced by a current I could not resist, a pull towards something ancient, forbidden, and impossibly powerful, and the pup whimpered again, shaking against me, and as I held it close, I felt that the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next, and I knew with a certainty that made my blood run cold and hot all at once, that I had stepped into a world I did not understand, a world that would not let me go, and somewhere in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the moonlight, he waited, and the night seemed to hum with a promise I could neither refuse nor comprehend. the days after the river incident should have been ordinary, should have slipped past like any other morning or evening, yet nothing felt ordinary, and the world seemed thinner, as if the veil between what I knew and what I could not see had been lifted just enough to let shadows breathe. The pup, now nestled in a soft blanket on the edge of my kitchen, seemed aware of more than just warmth and food, its ears twitching at sounds I could not hear, its eyes widening as if tracking invisible shapes in the corners of my home, and I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, the sensation of being watched threading through my every movement, making me jump at the creak of floorboards and the rustle of leaves outside my window, as if the forest I had always walked through with ease had grown something new in my absence, a presence I could not name yet felt in every hair standing on my arms and neck, and even the townspeople, once familiar and comfortable, seemed sharper, their gazes lingering a fraction too long, smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, hushed conversations halting when I approached, leaving a silence that pressed on my chest in a way I could not explain. And at night the dreams returned, more vivid, more insistent, visions of golden eyes glinting through dark woods, shadows that moved with purpose, figures watching me from places I could not reach, growls that shook the air around me yet made no sound in my waking hours, and I awoke gasping more than once. The pup pressed against me as if to say, "You are not alone," but even his warmth could not chase the unease clinging to my bones, nor the sense that every sound, every whisper, every sudden gust of wind carried a meaning I was not yet ready to understand, and the forest, once a place of solace, now seemed to shift when I walked near its edge, branches bending as if bowing to a presence beyond my comprehension, shadows twisting unnaturally under the silver moonlight, reflections in puddles and windows bending and flickering in ways that made me question whether my mind was turning against me. And one evening, as I carried the pup home after feeding it at the river's edge, I noticed footprints along the mud that did not match mine, larger, heavier, almost feline in their curve, the impressions pressed deep into the soft earth as if someone or something had walked there with purpose and yet left no sound, no further trace, vanishing as suddenly as they appeared, and I stopped, heart hammering, scanning the darkened treeline, telling myself it was imagination, the forest playing tricks on a tired mind. Yet the air thrummed with energy, a pulse that matched the quick rhythm of my own heartbeat, a vibration that hinted at awareness, a mind, a power I had no right to encounter. And the pup whimpered, its small body trembling, ears flattened against its head, eyes darting toward the shadows, and I realized that it sensed the same presence, a weight pressing down, a silent intelligence studying us both. And when I returned home, locking the door behind me, I felt no relief, only a tightening around my chest, a thread of anticipation that made it impossible to focus on mundane tasks. Cooking, cleaning, even simple breathing seemed layered with tension, as if each action could draw the attention of whatever lingered just beyond sight. And the townspeople, too, continued to act strangely, neighbors crossing the street to avoid casual greetings, the shopkeeper's eyes following me as I picked up groceries, children pointing with a whispering giggle that stopped when I turned, and I sensed that my ordinary life, the small routines that had always defined me, had become fragile, a thin veneer over a world now alive with forces I could not name, the air thick with uncertainty, every step I took on familiar paths suddenly heavy with meaning, every shadow stretching longer than it should, twisting toward me as if reaching. And at night, when I sat alone by the fire, the pup curled in my lap, I would hear sounds outside my window, the brush of wind through the trees that carried more than air, faint footfalls across the roof or along the walkway, soft, deliberate, watching, studying, and I could not tell whether it was curiosity, threat, or a message I was too small to understand. And the dreams, unrelenting, brought me glimpses of a figure standing at the edge of the river, tall and powerful, cloaked in shadows, golden eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run hot and cold all at once, the silhouette never moving closer yet never leaving, a constant reminder that I had stepped into a current I could not escape. And in the quiet hours before dawn, I would awake to find the pup staring at the doorway, ears pricked, body rigid as though sensing footsteps that never came, and I would shiver, feeling a prickle of fear mingled with a strange pull, a magnetic draw toward something I did not understand but could not resist. And ordinary sounds, the creak of floorboards, the whistle of the wind, the drip of water from a leaky roof, became charged signals of a presence weaving in and out of my life, and I realized that nothing was accidental anymore, that the river, the pup, the shadow in the forest, and my own heartbeat were threads in a tapestry far larger than my understanding, a design I had stumbled into by chance or fate, and every instinct screamed that the Alpha King, whoever or whatever he was, had already noticed me, that my actions had stirred a current far stronger than my own will, a force that would not be denied, and I could feel it tightening, pulling, as if my life was no longer solely mine, as if the fragile world I had inhabited for so long was bending around something ancient and inevitable, and the sense of safety I had clung to, the small boundaries of ordinary life, had dissolved entirely, leaving me exposed, alert, trembling, aware of the smallest movement in the shadows, the faintest sound in the night, the unspoken weight pressing on the air around me, until the unease became almost unbearable. A living thing coiled around my chest, and I knew, as I held the pup close and stared into the darkness beyond my windows, that something monumental had begun, a force of power and danger, desire and inevitability, waiting just beyond my sight, watching, and I could not look away, could not escape, and could not yet imagine the storm that was about to touch every corner of my world. The unease that had taken root in the days after the river seemed to stretch its fingers into every corner of my life, reaching into my home, my thoughts, and even the small streets of the town I had once known so well, and it began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, with the pup, growling low in his throat at nothing I could see, ears flattened and hackles raised as though a shadow had passed just beyond the reach of the lamplight, and I would look around, heart pounding, trying to catch movement to find the source, but the street remained empty. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a chill that made my skin prickle, and then came the notes, small scraps of parchment, delicate and yellowed as though aged, pinned to my door with sharp twigs, each one inscribed in ink that shimmered faintly under moonlight, a language I could not read yet seemed alive, curling letters that pricked at the edges of my memory, familiar yet unknowable, and I would stare at them for long minutes, feeling an invisible weight pressing against my chest, a sensation that I was being watched, studied, measured for something I could not name, and the people in town too seemed to have changed, whispers trailing me as I passed through the square, shopkeepers lowering voices, children pointing before giggling behind cupped hands, the subtle nods and half-smiles that carried warnings I did not yet understand. And one evening, as I walked past the fountain where we all gathered, an old woman, hunched and with eyes bright and sharp as flint, called my name softly, beckoning with a trembling hand, and when I approached, she leaned close enough for only me to hear, her breath cold and earthy, and she whispered words that made my heart stutter, warnings wrapped in riddles and old tales, half of which I could not comprehend, yet the meaning was clear enough to make me shiver, that I had stumbled into something older than the forest, older than the river, that forces were stirring and that I should be wary, and before I could respond she straightened, blending into the shadows of the square, leaving me alone with a pulse in my ears and a mind buzzing with questions I could not answer. And that night, the pup refused to sleep, pacing the floor, low growls vibrating from his chest, ears rotating toward every sound, his tail stiff and alert, and I followed his gaze to the window where moonlight fell across the floor in fractured beams, noticing movements in the trees that seemed deliberate enough to suggest intelligence, a shadow flickering in ways that contradicted the wind, and I could not tell if I was imagining it or if the forest itself had become a living thing, observing, testing, gauging, and then the first mark appeared on my door, faintly carved, precise and deliberate, a symbol etched into the wood, a triangle with a swirl at its center, the same shape as one of the notes, and my pulse raced, recognizing instinctively that it was a message, a signature, a warning or a promise, and the pup whimpered, pressing against my legs as though urging me to flee, and I knew instinctively that this was not a threat I could ignore, that someone or something was communicating with me through these signs, through the behaviors of the pup, through whispers that cut through the night air and the deliberate stillness of the town. And I began noticing other small anomalies, things that unsettled me even more, an owl staring at me from a branch with unnatural intelligence, tilting its head in a way that suggested it understood more than it should, dogs in the street growling without cause before vanishing into the shadows, and even the wind seemed to carry intent, brushing against my face as I walked home from the market, fingers brushing my cheek with the sensation of a human hand, soft, deliberate, familiar, yet impossible. And I began to feel that nothing in the town, nothing in my life, was as it had been, that the rescue of the pup had shifted something fundamental in the balance of things, that I had crossed a threshold I could not step back from, a threshold that had been watched for long before I even existed. And at night, the dreams continued, more insistent, golden eyes peering from darkness, figures moving silently behind trees, and sometimes I would wake to find faint impressions in the Dirt near the river, large footprints with clawed toes that vanished into the forest as though the earth itself had swallowed them, and I could not bring myself to walk there during daylight for fear of what I might see. Yet the pull was irresistible, the tug of destiny threading through my veins, pulling me towards something monumental that I did not understand, and I began to notice more direct signs. Objects slightly moved when I was not looking, small scratches on the wooden floor, marks that resembled the paw of the pup yet too large and deliberate, and I could feel an intelligence testing my attention, gauging my reaction as though it were learning the measure of my courage. My curiosity, my fear, and whispers in the dark became more frequent, carried on the wind through cracks in the walls and the open windows, indistinct syllables that left me both chilled and intrigued, words that seemed to curl into my ears with intent, speaking of fates and bonds and choices I had not yet made. And I began noticing strangers in town whose eyes followed me a fraction too long, men and women who lingered near the forest edge, disappearing when I approached, and I realized that their presence was connected, that they, like the marks and notes and whispers, were part of the same unseen current moving through my life, guiding me, warning me, observing me, and I could not shake the feeling that each step I took in my ordinary routines was already being measured, that my every breath and glance and movement was noted by powers I could not comprehend. And as the days lengthened into nights filled with moonlight and shadows, I found myself sitting at the window, the pup in my lap, tracing the shapes of the marks, the edges of the notes, listening for the whispers, feeling the pull of something immense just beyond my understanding, and the sensation of being observed, studied, tested, pressed close against my chest like a living thing, tightening with every hour until it became almost unbearable. And I knew, with a clarity that was both thrilling and terrifying, that I was no longer alone, that my ordinary life had been shattered by a force older than the forest, a force that had noticed me, that had recognized me, and that had begun to mark its presence, leaving signs and symbols, stirring whispers and glances, testing the boundaries of what I knew and what I could endure. And as I stared into the darkness, the pup whimpering softly against my legs, I realized that suspicion had taken root, solid and unyielding, twisting through my thoughts and nerves, and I could not tell if it was fear or anticipation. But I knew that the threads of something extraordinary were weaving into my life, and there was no turning back from the pull that had begun in the river, nor from the shadow that lingered, patient and golden-eyed, just beyond sight, watching, waiting, and already claiming more of me than I understood. The unease that had haunted my days and nights now pressed against me with a tangible weight, a presence that lingered in the spaces between shadows and moonlight. And it began one evening as I returned from the market, the pup nestled in my arms, small and shivering yet alert to attention I could not name, and I felt it before I saw it, a movement at the edge of my vision, a ripple through the air, a vibration along the ground that made the hairs on my arms stand on end, as if the earth itself were aware of him, aware of the power that now brushed against my life. And I paused on the path just beyond the last lamplight, senses straining, heart hammering in my chest, and there he was, or rather the suggestion of him, a shadow among the trees, tall and impossibly still, and I could not see his face, could not define the shape of his features, yet the pull was undeniable, magnetic, a current tugging at something deep within me, a mixture of fear and fascination that left my limbs tense and alert. And the pup growled low in his throat, ears flat, tail stiff, a warning or perhaps a recognition, and I took a hesitant step back, the wind whispering through the branches in a way that sounded almost like words, urging me to look, to run, to do something, yet paralyzing me with curiosity. And I caught the faintest shimmer in the air where he stood, a heat or energy that made the moonlight bend around him, refracting in silver streaks that danced across the leaves. And for a moment I wondered if my eyes were deceiving me, if exhaustion and fear were painting illusions in the night. Yet the pup whimpered again, nudging my leg, pressing me toward him and at the same time warning me away. And then he shifted, the shadow moving with such fluidity it seemed unreal, silent and deliberate, gliding closer and then retreating as if testing my reaction, measuring my courage, my curiosity, my fear, and my breath caught in my throat as the magnetic force tugged at my chest, making it impossible to look away, impossible to stop the heartbeat that raced like a drum in the quiet night. And though I could not see his eyes, I felt them on me, golden and sharp and ancient, burning through the dark, assessing, claiming, and the sense of inevitability prickled at the edge of my mind, whispering that this encounter was not random, that it had been waiting, predestined, and that every step I had taken since rescuing the pup had led me to this invisible line drawn between us, a thread of fate that now hummed with energy I could feel in my bones, and I realized with a jolt that he was no ordinary man, no mere observer, that power radiated from him in waves, a quiet strength that pressed against the world around him, bending air, shadow, and perhaps even thought to his presence, and I shivered, torn between the desire to retreat and the pull that drew me closer, the magnetic allure that wrapped around my consciousness and made every instinct both scream in warning and plead in fascination. And the forest seemed to lean in, trees bending subtly toward him, leaves trembling as if in recognition of his authority, the river nearby murmuring in soft agitation, a chorus of life acknowledging him in ways that made my chest tighten with a mix of awe and fear. And then a fox darted across the path, its eyes reflecting the moonlight in sharp flashes, and it froze, ears pricked, tail stiff, staring directly at the shadow before vanishing into the underbrush. And I realized the wildlife, too, recognized him, and that recognition carried a weight that pressed into my awareness, making it impossible to dismiss him as imagination, coincidence, or trick of the light. And a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, brushing my hair across my face and carrying a scent I could not name, rich and wild, earthy and intoxicating, something ancient and untamed that seemed to curl into my senses and anchor me to the spot. And I felt a pulse, subtle but undeniable, thrum in the air, a rhythm that matched the hammering of my own heartbeat. And it was then that I noticed the faint traces of movement around him, disturbances in the leaves, impressions in the moss that suggested he had been there longer than I realized. Observing, waiting, a hunter in his own right, yet patient, calculating, aware. And I understood that he could step forward at any moment or remain hidden indefinitely, that the choice, the timing, the revelation were entirely his to control, and I felt both fear and a curious longing to know more, to step closer despite every instinct screaming that danger accompanied this pull, that his presence was not entirely benign, that something in him carried consequences I could not yet comprehend. And the pup whimpered, shifting in my arms, ears twitching toward him, tail flicking. And I knew the small creature felt the same magnetic weight that I did, something primal and instinctual that did not require words to recognize the significance of the moment. And then a leaf brushed against my hand, falling from a branch with a delicate, deliberate arc as though he had moved the air around it without touching it, and the subtlety of the motion made my pulse spike, an invisible hand drawing me forward, teasing me with a reality that seemed both impossible and inevitable. And I felt the tug of destiny weaving through the cool night air, brushing against my thoughts, brushing against my skin, a thread of inevitability that wrapped around my senses and made every instinct vibrate with tension and anticipation. And I wondered if the shadow would ever take shape, step fully into the moonlight, speak, or make itself known. Yet in that moment I was paralyzed with curiosity, eyes locked on the shifting darkness, waiting for something, anything, that would reveal him. And though a part of me screamed to flee, to escape, to return to the fragile safety of my home, the pull would not let me, a magnetic force that hummed through the forest and into my chest, and I realized that I could not look away even if I wanted to, that my life had already tilted towards something monumental, something ancient and potent. And in the quiet heartbeat of the night, with the pup pressing against me and the shadows bending around him, I felt it, that electric, magnetic, unnerving connection, a thread of fate that had begun long before I had touched the river, long before I had saved the pup. And I knew that this was only the beginning, that the shadow, the presence, the force that lingered just beyond sight had marked me in ways I did not yet understand. And though he remained unseen, his shape indistinct, the pull of his power drew me forward, leaving me unsettled yet unable to tear my eyes away. Curiosity ignited, fear mingling with fascination, and the night whispered promises I could not yet name, leaving me standing at the edge of the forest, shivering, heart racing, breath caught in my throat, and knowing that something extraordinary had entered my life, something that would not let go, something I could neither resist nor fully comprehend. The forest seemed to hold its breath the night I first saw him fully, the shadows parting just enough for a figure to step forward, tall and impossibly powerful, golden eyes glinting under the silver moon, hair dark as the night itself falling in waves that caught the faint light, and the air around him thrummed with an energy I could feel in my chest, heavy and alive, making every nerve in my body stand on end, the pup whining softly in my arms yet refusing to hide, as if sensing the weight of his presence, and I froze, heart hammering, lungs shallow, every instinct screaming to run even as something deeper, something unnameable, pulled me closer, the force of him magnetic, drawing me forward with a tension that was both terrifying and intoxicating, and he regarded me with a gaze that burned and pierced, sharp and patient, studying me as if he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for me. The pull of his presence wrapping around me, tugging at my very soul, and the forest seemed to bend toward him, leaves trembling and shadows curling as if acknowledging his authority, the river nearby murmuring in quiet recognition, the wind carrying his scent, rich, wild, earthy, familiar in a way that made my head spin, a scent that ignited something primal and impossible to resist. And when he spoke, his voice was velvet over steel, low and resonant, words that seemed to penetrate the very air around us. "You should not have come this far alone," he said. Yet there was no anger in it, only weight, presence, a command that did not demand compliance yet left no room for hesitation. And I swallowed, realizing that despite the instinct to flee, to protect myself and the pup, I could not move, could not look away. Every step he took, deliberate and silent, made the hairs on my arms rise, my breath hitch, and a warmth spread from my chest that had nothing to do with the cold night air, something that unsettled me, that both thrilled and terrified. And he stopped just a few feet away, his golden gaze never leaving mine, and I noticed the subtle shift in the way he held himself, powerful yet fluid, a predator tempered by patience. And there was a tension between us, unspoken yet undeniable, something dangerous yet alluring, an energy that crackled in the space between us, tugging at a part of me I had never known existed, a connection that bypassed thought and reached straight into instinct. And I felt a flutter of forbidden curiosity, my pulse quickening, my hands tightening on the pup, the small creature whimpering softly yet refusing to recoil. And I understood that he too was aware of it, aware of the pull, the unspoken thread binding us, as if our fates had intertwined long before either of us knew. And when he tilted his head slightly, just the faintest gesture, it was enough to make the world shrink to the space between us, to the brush of energy that danced like static along my skin, my knees threatening to buckle under the weight of it. And the wind shifted, rustling leaves, carrying the whisper of his presence, and the sound seemed to wrap around me, pull me forward. Yet I resisted, gripping the pup tighter, trying to ground myself in reality, in reason, in the ordinary life I had once known, the life that now felt like a distant memory, unreachable and fragile. And he stepped closer, deliberately, each movement controlled, smooth, a predator in its own right yet careful, measured, the pull between us intensifying with every heartbeat. And I realized with a jolt that this was no ordinary encounter, no fleeting brush with a stranger, that the forest itself seemed to acknowledge him as a king, a force older than the river, older than any town, older than I could comprehend. And every instinct screamed both warning and desire, warning that I was treading into danger, desire that urged me to step closer, to surrender just a fraction to the magnetic tension that wrapped around my chest and mind. And then he extended a hand, slowly, deliberately, not touching yet close enough that I could feel the heat emanating from him, the energy, the command, the pull, and my breath caught, a shiver running down my spine, the pup whining softly against me, sensing the power, the danger, the inevitability. And my fingers itched to touch him, to make contact. Forbidden as the thought was, yet the magnetic tension was unbearable, a force that seemed to tug at my very being, a current I could not resist. And he tilted his head, and I felt it then, an understanding, a recognition unspoken yet clear, that I was not just seen, I was chosen, noted, measured, claimed even before either of us spoke the words that would mark the beginning of something neither of us could deny. And the energy between us swirled, heavy and thick, a storm barely contained in the still night, pulling at my heart, my mind, my instincts, forcing me to acknowledge what I had felt in the river, in the shadows, in the whispers, that my life had been altered, shifted onto a path I could not turn from. And I could see it in the way his shoulders moved, the way his gaze never wavered, that he was aware of the effect, aware of the magnetic hold that this meeting had on me, the subtle sparks of attraction that neither of us could fully name, yet both of us felt in the marrow of our bones. And I realized I had never felt anything like it, that danger and desire could coexist so completely, so overwhelmingly, that the thought of stepping back was as impossible as stepping forward, that every sense was alive, tuned to him, attuned to the pull that hummed through the air between us, and the forest seemed to breathe with us, wind whispering, leaves rustling, water murmuring, as if nature itself acknowledged the significance of the moment. And when he finally spoke again, voice low, deliberate, commanding, yet gentle, "Do not be afraid." I felt it more than heard it, a vibration in the chest, in the bones, in the pulse of my very life, a reassurance that only deepened the tension, the attraction, the impossibility of resisting the pull, and I knew that despite every instinct warning me, despite the danger, the magnetic force tethering us together was irresistible, a current I had no choice but to acknowledge, and when he stepped back into the shadows, melting into the night, leaving only the faintest warmth and lingering scent behind, I realized that I was trembling, heart racing, breath caught, and, though he had left me standing alone, the pull remained, a tangible force twisting through my chest and mind, leaving me shaken, unsettled, and profoundly aware of the depth to which I had already been drawn into something dangerous, powerful, and utterly irresistible. Life had begun to unravel in ways I could no longer ignore, threads of the ordinary world tangling with the extraordinary until every day felt like walking on the edge of a knife, and it started with small incidents, moments that seemed like coincidence but carried a weight and precision that unsettled me to my core, a window rattling violently when no wind blew, a shadow flickering across the living room floor that did not belong to anything I could see, the pup growling low in his throat at empty corners as if he could sense the pulse of something unseen, and then there were the dreams, vivid and relentless, dragging me into the forest again and again, showing me golden eyes, powerful figures moving silently between the trees, murmuring my name in voices that seemed both distant and impossibly close, pulling me into a world I could no longer pretend did not exist, and I began noticing coincidences that felt too precise to be random, the river bubbling with urgency when I approached, leaves swirling in patterns that hinted at signs, messages I could not yet read, and townspeople whose eyes lingered on me with a knowing intensity, whispers of caution that vanished when I tried to grasp them, a murmur of warnings that seemed to hang in the air even when the streets were empty, and my routines, once comforting and predictable, became treacherous, as if the very fabric of reality was bending to accommodate forces I could neither see nor deny. Objects moved from where I had left them, a door left ajar that I could swear I had closed, footprints appearing in the mud outside my home that were too large, too deliberate, too impossible to ignore, and I felt the pull of him, the Alpha King, more strongly with every heartbeat, a current threading through my veins, stirring something wild and untamable within me, and the pup, attuned to forces I barely sensed, yipped sharply at shadows, his fur bristling, claws scratching the floor as if warning me that the world had shifted, that boundaries had been broken, and even my own body betrayed me, muscles tensing and relaxing without thought, a heightened awareness that made every sound, every whisper of wind, every flicker of movement carry weight, meaning, danger, and I could no longer pretend that these incidents were mere imagination or stress, that there was nothing beyond the river, beyond the forest, beyond the magnetic presence that had stepped into my life with golden eyes and silent command. And then the accidents began, subtle at first, a vase toppled inexplicably, a ladder sliding when no one had touched it, a brush with a falling branch in the forest that narrowly missed my head as if the trees themselves were conspiring or warning, and the dreams intensified, a tapestry of power and shadow weaving into my sleep until I could not distinguish dream from reality, until the golden eyes seemed to follow me into the waking world, lingering in reflections, in puddles, in the glint of moonlight across glass, and I began sensing his presence even when he was not visible, a subtle warmth, a hum of energy vibrating through the ground beneath my feet, the air thickening with anticipation, and the pup whined, constantly, restless, shifting from foot to foot, pawing at my hands, nudging me toward the forest edge as though urging me to move or warning me to retreat, and ordinary objects took on significance I could not ignore, patterns in the bark of trees resembling the symbols I had seen before, markings on stones along the riverbank forming shapes that felt deliberate, meaningful, part of a language I did not yet understand, and I realized with a jolt that every element of my world, every leaf, stone, ripple of water, whisper of wind, had become part of the same current, a force weaving through my life with intent, precision and power. And then the danger arrived, sudden, sharp, unavoidable, a rustle in the underbrush that made my pulse spike, the pup growling ferociously, hackles raised, ears flat, a low growl vibrating through the night air, and I turned, heart hammering, to see a figure stepping from the shadows, taller and broader than any man I had ever known, movements silent yet impossibly fast, eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight, and I felt the pull of fear and fascination swirl together. Magnetic current I could not resist even as instinct screamed to flee, and the air vibrated with tension, the forest alive around us, leaves trembling, the river murmuring urgently as if warning me, and the figure paused, just far enough to keep me guessing, just close enough to make my chest tighten with recognition. And then the pup yelped sharply as something darted past, a movement too fast for the eye to track, brushing the edge of my coat, and I felt the energy spike, a sudden crackling through the air that made the hairs on my arms rise, and a tree branch snapped behind me, startling me into motion, my feet slipping on the wet moss, the pup scrambling in my arms, claws digging into my skin, teeth gritting at the tension, and I realized with a jolt that I had crossed into a world I could no longer retreat from, a collision of my ordinary life with the extraordinary, a reality that moved around me like a living thing, bending and shifting, and I felt the pull of him again, the Alpha King, that magnetic force threading through my chest, compelling me to stay, to watch, to participate, and yet the danger was real, immediate, present, the forest alive with unseen eyes, movements in the underbrush, whispers in the wind, shadows that shifted without source, and the pup squirmed violently, ears flat, tail stiff, and I stumbled back toward the river, heart racing, breath shallow, every muscle taut with awareness, the adrenaline pulsing through me as if the night itself were demanding attention, and I knew that this was only the beginning, that the accidents, the dreams, the coincidences, the signs, the pull, the danger were all threads in a tapestry far larger than I could yet comprehend, that my life had been entwined with forces older, more powerful, and more inevitable than I could have imagined, and I felt the forest hold its breath, the river murmur louder, the pup tremble in my arms, and then movement, sharp and sudden, a shadow lunging, almost invisible, brushing past with impossible speed, a force that made my stomach drop, and I realized I could no longer deny the supernatural stirring around me, that my ordinary life had shattered, replaced by a current of danger, attraction, and destiny that left me breathless, aware, and utterly unprepared. And as I scrambled toward the safety of the path, the forest alive with unseen threats and magnetic presence, I knew that my world had collided with his, with the extraordinary, and that nothing would ever be the same again, and in that instant the night felt alive, watching, waiting, and I could feel the danger pressing closer with every heartbeat, leaving me trembling, heart hammering, and utterly aware that I had stepped into something far greater than myself. The days that followed the collision in the forest left me restless in ways I could not name, and despite the danger and the magnetic pull that had gripped me, I found myself thinking of him constantly, the Alpha King, the golden-eyed shadow whose presence had become impossible to ignore, and when he appeared again at the edge of the woods, no longer hidden, yet still carrying an air of untouchable mystery, I felt a shiver run through me, anticipation mingling with fear, the pup pressing close, sensing the tension that hummed between us like a living thread, and he spoke first, his voice low and smooth, carrying that command and resonance I could not resist, asking questions that seemed simple yet held layers, probing my thoughts and courage, and I answered as truthfully as I could, words spilling from my lips in a stream I barely recognized as my own, and we began to talk, slowly at first, voices soft over the rustling leaves, the river murmuring nearby, about the forest, about the animals, about the currents in the world that I had begun to feel but could not yet understand, and in his presence I noticed how words themselves seemed to bend toward meaning, how gestures carried weight, how a glance could speak more than any sentence, the way he would tilt his head when listening, or how his hand hovered just short of mine, creating tension that left my pulse racing, and I found myself drawn into the rhythm of him, the cadence of his voice, the subtle power in his movements, a pull I could not deny, and the pup, normally restless, seemed to relax slightly in his presence, as if recognizing something essential in him, a force I could not yet name, and I began to notice small acts, gestures that made my chest ache with longing and fear, the way he would brush a strand of hair from my face, careful, deliberate, leaving a warmth that lingered, the way his gaze lingered a fraction too long when I spoke, golden eyes shimmering with unspoken truths, and I realized that despite every warning, every instinct screaming danger, I was drawn in, more deeply than I had ever allowed myself, the threads of attraction weaving around my mind and body, binding me to him in ways I could not articulate, and we shared secrets too, fragments of history, pieces of a life older and richer than my own, tales of the pack, of the river, of the forest and its guardians, words that seemed to carry power in their telling, making the night feel alive, electric, aware, and I began to trust him in small ways, revealing fears I had never voiced, uncertainties that had plagued me, and he listened with patience, with understanding, yet always with that tension, that pull of dominance and magnetism, reminding me that our bond, growing as it was still forbidden, dangerous, and potent, and in the quiet moments when we stood close beneath the trees, the wind carrying the scent of pine and river and something uniquely him. I felt an ache of longing that mingled with awe, a desire tempered by fear, a curiosity I could not resist, a pull that made the ordinary world fade into irrelevance, leaving only him and the thrum of his presence. The pup nestled in my arms, ears twitching, sensing the energy that wrapped us both, and I noticed subtle movements, a brush of hand, a step closer than necessary, eyes that glimmered with recognition of what neither of us would name, a connection that deepened in silence as much as in conversation, a binding that was unspoken yet undeniable, and I felt the gravity of it pressing into my chest, a force that made my breath catch, that set my pulse racing, that left me aware of every detail, every sound, every heartbeat in the forest. And then he moved suddenly, a step into the moonlight, and I saw it, the first glimpse of what I had suspected, yet could not fully imagine, a flicker of his true self, something in his form shifting, subtle at first, a muscle tightening, a glimmer of golden fur along the edge of his jaw, the sharp outline of his fangs catching the light, and my breath froze in my chest, heart hammering, a mixture of awe, fear, and fascination surging through me, because this was no ordinary man, no mere human, yet the pull, the connection, the bond only deepened in response to this revelation, the forbidden attraction, now layered with something far older, far more primal, and I realized that the threads weaving between us, tension, desire, trust, danger, curiosity, were part of something ancient and unbreakable, and the pup whimpered softly, pressing closer, sensing the shift, as if acknowledging what I was only beginning to understand, the duality of him, the shadow and the king, the human and the beast, and my mind raced with the implications, with the thrill of fear, the ache of attraction, the undeniable truth that I had stepped into a world that would consume me if I let it, yet offered a connection unlike any other I had ever known, and I could feel it in my bones, in my pulse, in the quiver of energy that ran from the tips of my fingers to the small of my back, that I was irrevocably tied to him, marked by our encounters, by the bond we were forging, by the secret glimpses of power and form he revealed, and though a part of me screamed to retreat, to protect myself, to flee back into the fragile safety of my ordinary life, that part was drowned out by a deeper current, a magnetic draw, a fascination and longing that made every instinct for caution feel almost irrelevant, and as he stepped back, letting the shadows reclaim him, golden eyes lingering on mine until the last flicker of light swallowed him, I realized that I was trembling, heart racing, mind ablaze with questions, with fear, with desire, with awe, and I knew that the forest, the river, the pup, the night, and this extraordinary figure had changed my life in ways that could never be undone, and though he had retreated, leaving me standing in the quiet moonlight, I could still feel him, still sense the pull, still feel the bond strengthening, and I understood with a jolt that every day, every encounter, every glance, every shared word, every secret, every gesture, was weaving a connection that was beyond simple attraction, beyond simple curiosity, something older, deeper, primal, powerful and utterly forbidden, and my chest ached with the weight of it, with the wonder and the danger. And then, just as I thought I could regain my composure, the wind shifted, carrying the faintest sound, the hint of a growl, not from the pup but from him, from the presence that lingered just beyond the shadows, and I caught the flicker again, subtle, almost imperceptible, a glint of gold along the curve of his jaw, a hint of teeth that were not human, and I staggered back, the realization hitting me with force, that I had glimpsed something true, primal, terrifying, magnificent, and the forbidden bond that drew me to him became undeniable, a thread that wrapped around my heart, my mind, my instincts, leaving me shivering, breathless, and profoundly aware that I was irrevocably, hopelessly, and dangerously entangled with a being I could neither resist nor fully comprehend. The days after my first glimpse of his true form left a residue on my mind that I could not shake, a constant, pulsing awareness that something in the world had shifted irreversibly, and it began with small fractures in my perception, subtle disturbances that hinted at powers I could barely comprehend, objects moving of their own accord, shadows twisting just beyond the edge of sight, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye that vanished before I could focus, the pup growling, ears flat, tail stiff, pressed against me with a warning I could not ignore, and I began noticing other anomalies, patterns in the forest, the river running with a current that seemed faster, sharper, alive with intent, the trees bending in ways that suggested a consciousness beyond the ordinary, and when he appeared again, stepping from the shadows with that magnetic presence that still left my knees weak, the pull of attraction was impossible to deny, yet a new layer of fear threaded through me, a recognition that the glimpses I had seen of him were only fragments, pieces of a nature too immense and powerful to fully grasp, and I realized that the golden eyes, the glint of fangs, the subtle shifts in muscle and form, were not occasional, nor accidental but integral, a constant reminder of what he was capable of, a presence that could dominate the air, the earth, the very space around him, bending the natural world without a word, a gesture, a thought, and the pup whimpered, nudging me closer, sensing my uncertainty, my fascination, my fear, and I felt torn, the magnetic draw of his energy pulling me toward him even as instinct screamed to flee, a battle within my chest, heart hammering, pulse racing, adrenaline and desire, blending into a cocktail of confusion and need, and he spoke, low, deliberate voice carrying a weight that made the hair on my arms stand on end, words that were soft yet impossible to ignore, questions that seemed to probe not only my mind but the thread of my soul, and I answered truthfully, though every word carried the awareness that he could sense my fear, my hesitation, my curiosity, my longing, and I realized then that the trust one had felt was fragile, built on glimpses and shared words, gestures and silent connection, yet underpinned by truths I could not yet know, and there were moments, fleeting, yet sharp, when his power pressed too close, when the air seemed to thrum with intent, and I caught shadows in the corner of my vision, movements that suggested strength beyond comprehension, a force I could neither predict nor control, and every time he stepped closer, even in the mundane act of conversation, the pull of danger intertwined with desire, the knowledge that something wild and primal lived within him, and it was as if the forest itself acknowledged it, the wind shifting, leaves rustling in ways that suggested communication, the river murmuring as if warning, and I began to question every instinct, every choice that had brought me this far, and yet I could not turn away, could not resist the gravity of his presence, the threads of bond and tension weaving tighter with every shared glance, every quiet gesture, and yet the fractures of truth gnawed at me, whispering that I had been brought into something I could not fully understand, that the attraction, the curiosity, the bond were tangled with fear, and that one misstep could undo everything, leaving me exposed, vulnerable, irrevocably entwined with a being whose power and intentions were only partially revealed, and I realized that even the pup, usually my anchor, seemed caught in the same tension, ears twitching, tail stiff, growling softly at shadows and movements that my eyes could not track, sensing the duality of him, the predator and protector, the king and the shadow, the human and the force beyond comprehension, and I found myself noticing patterns, subtle signs of his presence when he was not there, the faintest warmth in the air, the shimmer of movement across leaves, the subtle shifts in light and shadow that seemed to respond to memory, presence, awareness, and I understood that the fragments I had glimpsed were only the edges of a truth too vast for my mind to hold, yet the pull of him made it impossible to walk away, and the danger became a part of the allure, a siren call that set my nerves on fire even as fear threaded through every thought, and there were moments when his gaze lingered, golden eyes fixed on mine, that I could feel the depth of what he was, the power, the age, the dominance and authority, and yet he remained partially hidden, keeping the full truth at bay, a careful control that left me entranced and uncertain, desire and dread coiled tightly in my chest, and I caught glimpses of the wolf within him, subtle but undeniable, muscles shifting, the scent that rose faintly around him, the hair on my arms rising involuntarily, the pup growling low, yet the fascination was inescapable, magnetic, pulling me toward danger even as the rational part of my mind screamed that I should step back, and I realized that the bond we were forging was layered with lies of omission, truths half revealed, power unspoken yet felt, and the forest seemed to participate, alive with energy, warning, acknowledging, bending subtly to him and leaving me breathless, aware and fearful, and I felt the threads of attraction, trust, and danger intertwine in a complicated knot that I could not untangle, and every shared word, every silent moment, every gesture, only deepened the connection while exposing the fractures in my understanding, leaving me on edge, chest tight, pulse racing, heart aware of every shift, and then a shadow flickered, sharper this time, movement too fast to be natural, and the pup whimpered sharply, pressing into me, eyes wide, ears flat, sensing a predator I could not yet see, and I realized with a jolt that even as I had grown closer, even as curiosity and desire drew me in, I had never truly known him, had only glimpsed pieces, fragments of a being both magnificent and terrifying, and the mistrust settled like a cold weight over the warmth I had begun to feel, chilling my bones, tightening my chest, a reminder that fascination and fear were inseparable, that the threads of attraction were laced with danger, and that the bond we were forming could not be taken at face value. For the truth was larger than I could comprehend, older, more powerful, a force I could not yet name, and as he stepped back into the shadows, leaving only the faintest trace of warmth and scent, I realized that the mystery was far from solved, that the fractures of truth had only multiplied, that the bond between us was fraught with danger and desire, and that my heart and instincts were caught between awe and fear, fascination and mistrust, leaving me trembling, breathless, and acutely aware that the next encounter could bring revelation or peril, and that I could not turn away, nor could I fully trust what I had been shown, for the shadow of uncertainty now loomed over our connection, a silent warning threading through every heartbeat, every glance, every pull of attraction that made me ache with longing even as it set my nerves on fire. The days after the glimpses of his true nature left me restless in ways that seemed impossible to contain, a tension coiling through my chest that made ordinary tasks feel hollow, and despite the warnings echoing in every instinct, despite the mistrust that shadowed our connection, I found myself thinking of him constantly, the Alpha King with golden eyes that could pierce through the strongest of walls and hands that seemed to leave heat on the air long after they had moved, and every thought of him carried both desire and dread, a magnetic pull that I tried to resist but found impossible, and at night the dreams came unbidden, vivid and unrelenting, dragging me back to the forest, where shadows danced and whispered my name in tones both soothing and commanding, a duality that left me trembling, heart racing, pulse caught somewhere between fear and anticipation, and I awoke in the early hours, skin tingling, sheets twisted around me, the pup whining softly, nudging my arm as if sensing the same stirring of energy that had invaded my sleep. And during the day I caught glimpses of the impossible in the corners of my vision, shadows flicking with purpose, wind carrying scents and currents I could not name, and each time I felt his presence, subtle but insistent, like a hand brushing the edge of my mind, calling me back, compelling me to acknowledge the connection that had already taken root, and I tried to focus on ordinary life, walking the streets, tending the garden, preparing meals, but the pull followed, a low hum in my chest, a weight pressing against my senses, and every time a branch bent strangely in the forest or a shadow flickered across the windowpane, I felt his awareness, his energy, tugging me toward the impossible, and I found myself walking to the edge of the river, heart hammering, watching the currents move in patterns that seemed deliberate, imagining him standing just beyond the trees, golden eyes gleaming, and a shiver ran through me that was equal parts fear and longing, and in the quiet moments I began noticing how my own emotions tangled with these visions, desire mixing with terror, fascination with caution, the pull of his energy threading through my veins, making my thoughts and breath uneven, making the world seem thinner, less substantial, more fluid, more malleable to something beyond my understanding, and I caught myself wondering if I had always been aware of this force in the world, this undercurrent of power that drew certain people together, and why I, of all people, had been ensnared, and then I would remember the pup in my arms, the small weight of life I had saved from the river, and the knowledge that he had saved me from my own complacency, that every heartbeat had led me closer to the pull, closer to the energy that hummed with danger and attraction, and I tried to distract myself with chores, with the familiar routines of daily life, yet even in conversation my mind would drift to him, imagining the brush of his hand, the depth of his gaze, the warmth that radiated from him even when he was absent, and the pup would grow restless, shifting at my feet, whimpering softly as if aware of the tension that I could not fully articulate, and I began to understand that desire and fear had entwined so completely that each thought of him was electric, each memory of his presence a spark that left me trembling, breathless, longing and wary, and then came moments when I saw him in fleeting glimpses, shadows bending, trees shifting, the wind carrying the scent of something wild, untamed, yet familiar, and I could not resist moving toward the signs, each step a battle between the rational mind and the pull that coursed through my chest, a force I could not name, could not deny, and every encounter, even the smallest hint of him, left me shivering, heart racing, body aware in ways I could not explain, and the dreams grew more intense, vivid in color, in sound, in sensation, dragging me into the forest in ways that blurred the lines between sleep and waking, leaving me disoriented, craving, aching with a longing I could neither satisfy nor name, and I tried to tell myself it was fantasy, it was fear, it was the remnants of adrenaline from the river and the shadows, yet every instinct, every pulse in my veins, contradicted my rational thoughts, insisting that he was real, that the connection was real, that the pull I felt was as undeniable as the air I breathed, and I realized with a jolt that resisting him was no longer possible, that the thread connecting us had grown into a tether, invisible yet unbreakable, and every day, every step, every heartbeat reminded me that the temptation was not only real but inevitable, that I had been drawn into a current far stronger than myself, and the forest, the river, the night, and even the pup all seemed to conspire to keep me aware of the pull, of the bond, of the forbidden attraction that ignited every nerve, every thought, every fiber of my being. And then one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground, I found myself at the forest's edge once more. The pup pressed against my leg, ears twitching, tail stiff, sensing the tension I felt in my own chest, and I saw him there, emerging from the shadows with that same magnetic presence that left me breathless, golden eyes gleaming, lips curved in the faintest half-smile, body relaxed yet taut with power, and I knew, with every instinct screaming and every nerve alive, that this encounter was not one I could resist, that the temptation would demand my attention, my focus, my surrender even in the smallest measure, and I felt my knees weaken, my chest tighten, breath catching in my throat because the pull was no longer subtle, no longer just a current in the background of my life. It was undeniable, overwhelming, pressing against me, inviting, commanding, and I understood with clarity that I would have to face this temptation, that the threat of desire and danger was no longer a choice to ignore, that it would seize me, claim me, bind me, whether I was ready or not, and the pup whimpered softly, pressing closer. Yet even his warning could not dim the pull, the energy, the irresistible call, and I took a trembling step forward, heart pounding, pulse racing, awareness sharp and raw, fully conscious of the danger, of the attraction, of the forbidden draw that had become impossible to resist, and I realized, with a mixture of fear and awe, that I was standing on the precipice of surrender, that every instinct, every dream, every thread of attraction had led me to this moment, that the temptation was not a choice but a force, and I could no longer deny it, could no longer resist it, and the night hung around us, thick with energy, alive with pull, and I felt it deep in my bones, a current I could not escape, and I knew that whatever happened next, the encounter waiting at the forest edge would define the course of everything, and I was trembling, breathless, and utterly, irrevocably drawn to it, to him, to the forbidden temptation I could not ignore. The fragile sense of safety I had been clinging to shattered the moment I sensed it, a ripple of darkness threading through the forest like smoke carried by the wind, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, yet enough to make the hairs on my arms rise and the pup growl low in his throat, ears flat, tail stiff, pressed close against my leg as if he could sense the encroaching danger I could not yet name. And it began with whispers in the wind, voices layered with malice and authority that seemed not to belong to any living human, subtle rustlings in the underbrush that suggested movement where none should have been, shadows stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic, and the river, once a constant murmuring companion, surged in currents sharp and sudden, splashing against rocks with unnatural force, carrying a sense of urgency that left me breathless and tense, and I realized with a cold jolt that something or someone was approaching, that the magnetic pull I felt toward the Alpha King was now entwined with a threat I could not yet fully comprehend, a force from his past bleeding into my present, tethering me to a danger I could neither evade nor ignore, and when he appeared, stepping from the shadows with his usual presence that had always been both magnetic and terrifying, golden eyes glinting, muscles coiled like a predator prepared for confrontation, I sensed the tension threading through him, the subtle change in the air around us, a warning that he had not shared, or perhaps had not yet fully understood himself, and I noticed the way his gaze shifted repeatedly toward the forest edges, alert and calculating, every movement deliberate, each breath measured, his every sense attuned to the unseen forces that now pressed closer to us, and I felt a shiver run through me, a mixture of awe and fear, realizing that the bond that had grown between us would now be tested by threats far larger than our own desires, larger than the forest, the river, the night itself, and the pup whined softly, nudging my leg, and I understood his anxiety mirrored mine, that instincts sharp and far beyond my understanding were screaming a warning I could not yet fully decode. And the forest seemed to participate in the tension. Leaves trembling, shadows stretching unnaturally, branches snapping in the distance as if signaling the arrival of unseen adversaries, and I felt my chest tighten, pulse racing, as I realized that these forces were neither random nor accidental, that they carried intent, that they sought to touch the Alpha King through me, to challenge, to threaten, to draw out something I could not yet grasp, and I caught glimpses of movement beyond the trees, shapes too swift for the eye to track, figures that vanished before I could focus, and the wind-carried scents, sharp and alien, that set my senses on fire, a mixture of earthy wilderness and something darker, something powerful, something ancient that seemed aligned with forces I had not yet encountered. And I realized with a jolt that the Alpha King was not invincible, that even his strength and presence had limits, and that whatever stalked us had been shaped by his past, carrying grievances and power that now intersected with my life in ways I could not anticipate. And I felt a surge of fear mingled with the pull I had always felt toward him, the magnetic tension that had bound me in attraction and fascination now laced with anxiety, dread, and uncertainty, and every instinct screamed that the coming confrontation would not be subtle, that the ordinary boundaries of safety no longer applied, that the shadows and whispers were only a prelude to a danger that would not hesitate to strike. And as he moved closer to me, protective, yet coiled with anticipation, golden eyes scanning every angle, every rustle, I felt the weight of the bond between us intensify, pulling me into awareness of both desire and peril, my body reacting to the magnetic presence even as my mind grappled with the reality of the threat. And I noticed subtle shifts in his form, the faintest flare of golden fur along his jaw, a glint of fangs catching the moonlight, a reminder of his duality, predator and protector, human and force beyond understanding. And the pup whimpered softly, tail twitching nervously, pressed closer against me, and I realized with growing alarm that the danger was no longer theoretical, that it had materialized in ways tangible and immediate, threaded through the forest, carried in shadows and wind, alive and aware, and every instinct screamed that there was no hiding from it, that we would have to confront it, that the balance of attraction and bond we had been nurturing would now collide with forces determined to unravel it. And then movement, sudden and sharp, drew our attention toward the far edge of the river, a ripple that suggested more than water, a disturbance that could not be accounted for by animals or wind, and I caught a flash of eyes, dark and calculating, observing us from the underbrush, and my stomach dropped as I realized that the threat had found us, that it had been patient, waiting, watching, and that every thread of my connection to him, every moment of trust and attraction, was now entwined with a force that could bring destruction if mishandled. And he growled low, a vibration I felt in my chest, body coiled, senses flaring, and I understood that the Alpha King was aware of what I had just seen, that he was preparing, calculating, weighing the threat against his power and mine, and that whatever came next would test every bond, every instinct, every ounce of trust we had built. And as the wind shifted, carrying the faintest sound of movement, a whisper of intent, I felt my pulse spike, chest tightening, awareness expanding to every leaf, every shadow, every breath of wind, and the pup yipped sharply, pressing closer, signaling that the presence of this adversary was no longer distant, no longer a rumor, but real, tangible, breathing, patient and calculated. And I realized with horror and fascination that our lives had been intertwined with forces far older, far more dangerous than I could have imagined, that the threads of attraction, fascination, and connection had become inseparable from the shadow of threat looming over us. And as I watched the Alpha King, body tense, eyes scanning, senses flaring, I understood that the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, acknowledging the presence of this dark force, and I felt a shiver run through me, a mixture of dread and awareness, knowing that whatever happened next, the danger was no longer theoretical, it was imminent, unavoidable, and that the bond, the attraction, the fascination I felt would be tested by forces that were patient, powerful, and merciless. And as the shadows deepened along the edge of the river, and the wind carried a faint, deliberate whisper of intent, I realized fully and terrifyingly that the threat was real, that it had arrived, and that the moments to come would demand every ounce of courage, trust, and awareness I possessed. The air was thick with unease the morning after the encounter by the river, tension hanging over me like a living weight, and I could not shake the sensation that the threads of my own life were entwined with something far older, far darker, a force that had been lying dormant, waiting for this moment, waiting for me to step fully into the web that had been spun long before I was born. And it began with a letter, delivered without explanation, its edges yellowed with age, script elegant and precise, yet foreign in its phrasing, words that carried a weight I could feel pressing against my chest as I broke the seal and unfolded the fragile paper, the ink swirling in patterns that seemed alive, the sentences telling a story that made my pulse spike and my stomach twist, revealing a lineage I had never known, a bloodline steeped in shadows and power, in prophecy and curse, and I read about ancestors whose deeds had shaped the forest and river, whose choices had rippled across generations to land squarely upon me, and my mind raced as I traced each name, each tale, recognizing faces from old family portraits whose eyes seemed now to gleam with hidden knowledge, and the words spoke of bonds with the supernatural, of alliances with forces older than memory, of protection and power, and I realized with a cold shock that my own existence had always been tied to these currents, to the world of the Alpha King, to the forces I had only begun to glimpse in fleeting shadows and magnetic pulls, and the letter detailed an ancient prophecy, one that spoke of a child born of my line, marked to bridge worlds, to draw the attention of beings who moved beyond human understanding, a child whose presence could shift balance, whose blood was coveted, whose life would be intertwined with danger, power, and forbidden attraction. And my heart raced as the pieces fell into place. Memories and sensations I had dismissed suddenly aligned with the words on the page. The dreams, the pull toward him, the forest, the river, the sense of being watched, all threading back to a legacy I had never chosen but could not escape. And I remembered my parents' hushed conversations, the odd warnings in their voices, the vague admonitions to never stray too far, and I saw now that they had known, that they had shielded me as best they could, yet had been powerless to prevent the inevitable. And the pup whimpered softly, pressing against my leg as if aware of the revelation coursing through me, sensing the shift in energy, the weight of destiny, and I felt a tremor run through my body, a mixture of fear, awe, and the magnetic pull that had first drawn me to him, and I thought of the Alpha King, of his golden eyes, of the glimpses of power I had seen, and I realized that the bond between us was no accident, that it had been written long before our paths crossed, that my blood, my lineage, had been part of the design, part of the force that drew him to me, and that every pull, every glance, every shared word had been influenced by a legacy I could never have understood until now, and anger, confusion, and grief warred within me, grief for the family who had kept secrets, confusion at the enormity of what I had just discovered, anger at the inevitability that had been imposed upon me. Yet alongside all these emotions was an undeniable fascination, a magnetic attraction to the very force that had brought him and me together. And as I folded the letter with trembling hands, I noticed symbols etched faintly in the margins, markings that matched those I had glimpsed in the forest, on stones by the river, subtle signs that had seemed like coincidence but were now part of a pattern, a code, a language of power and legacy that tied my blood to forces I could barely name. And the realization hit me with such force that I staggered back, pup scrambling to stay by my side, that my own heart, my own veins, carried the weight of prophecy, of power, of danger that could no longer be ignored or denied. And I thought of him, the Alpha King, predator and protector, human in force beyond comprehension, and I understood that his presence in my life, his pull, his fascination with me, was intricately linked to the truths I had just uncovered, that he had recognized the mark, the bloodline, the tether of prophecy that ran through me, and every instinct screamed that the bond we had formed was no longer merely personal, emotional, or magnetic. It was elemental, predestined, unavoidable, and the weight of that realization made my chest tighten, pulse racing, every nerve alive with tension, and I felt the forest around me thrum with awareness, the river murmuring with urgency, the wind carrying faint whispers that seemed to speak directly to me, acknowledging the legacy I had discovered, acknowledging the bond one had unwittingly stepped into, and I saw visions flash through my mind, fragments of ancestors, walking these same paths, encountering forces I could now name, making choices that had led to this night, choices that had left me the inheritor of both power and peril. And the pup whimpered again, pressing closer, tail stiff, ears flat, sensing my fear, my awe, my confusion, my fascination, and I understood fully that this revelation had changed everything, that my life had been intertwined with forces far beyond my comprehension, that my attraction to him, the Alpha King, was not merely personal, it was a product of destiny, prophecy, blood, and the unseen currents that had always moved through our world, and I felt tears sting my eyes, a mixture of grief, fear, and exhilaration, for the enormity of it was almost unbearable, the responsibility, the danger, the inevitability of what was to come, and yet beneath it all was a magnetic pull that would not allow me to turn away, that whispered of connection, of desire, of bond, and I realized that even as I shook with the weight of revelation, even as my heart raced and my chest ached with the enormity of the truth, I could not escape the force that had drawn him to me, the force that tied my bloodline to the Alpha King, To the forest, the river, the shadows, and to the destiny I had never chosen but could never deny. And I fell to my knees, pup pressed against my chest, hands trembling, mind reeling, as the letter slipped from my fingers and the wind stirred the edges of it on the floor, carrying the faintest echo of whispers of prophecy, of legacy. And I realized in that instant that my life had been irrevocably altered, that the secrets of blood had been revealed, and that I was left trembling, breathless, and profoundly shaken to my very core, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The forest seemed to hold its breath as I followed him along the winding path, the pup pressed close against my leg, ears twitching at every rustle and snap of the underbrush. And though I wanted to believe in the bond that had grown between us, the attraction and connection I had felt since the river incident now trembled under the weight of doubt, every gesture, every glance scrutinized for hidden meaning, and I could feel the tension in his body as well, taut like a drawn bow, golden eyes scanning the shadows, muscles coiled with readiness, a predator alert to every movement, and I realized that we were both aware that danger was near, and yet our mutual attraction, the magnetic pull, was a constant. A force that tugged at the edges of reason even as fear pressed in, and I struggled with the contradictions, wanting to trust him fully while the fragments of truth, the glimpses of power, the half-revealed nature, lingered in my mind like a shadow that would not disperse, and every conversation we had was layered with meaning, every word weighed, every gesture interpreted for intent, the pup whining softly as if sensing my tension, and I remembered the letter, the revelation of my bloodline. The prophecy and the fact that the threads that bound us were no longer casual, they were ancient, predestined, powerful, and yet fragile, for trust could break under the weight of lies or omission, and I felt my stomach twist as I wondered if I had misjudged him, if the glimpses of kindness, the protective gestures, the magnetic pull had masked ulterior motives, and I studied him closely as he moved beside me, golden eyes catching the fading sunlight filtering through the trees, body tense, yet controlled, aura of authority and danger undiminished, and I noticed subtle shifts, the way his jaw tightened when he spoke of the pack, the way a flicker of anger crossed his eyes at an unseen thought, the way he seemed to measure every word I spoke, weighing it, analyzing it, and I began to feel the prickling unease that had been growing in the back of my mind for days, the realization that perhaps trust was something I could not give freely, that the bond, though powerful, was vulnerable to fracture under deception, misunderstanding, or outside influence, and the forest seemed to mirror my thoughts, shadows bending unnaturally, wind whispering through the leaves with a voice that seemed to echo my doubts, and every instinct told me to proceed carefully, to test the lines between truth and omission, to watch for signs of danger hidden in the guise of connection, and I remembered the subtle flashes of his true nature, the glimpses of the wolf, the predator, the golden eyes reflecting something beyond human comprehension. And I questioned whether the moments of tenderness had been genuine, whether the magnetic pull I felt had been only part of a plan, a preordained thread of destiny that drew me into his orbit, or if there was authenticity in his regard for me. And the pup whimpered, nudging my hand, reminding me of the weight of responsibility I carried, the pull of prophecy and bloodline that tied me irrevocably to forces I could not control, and yet I wanted to believe, to reach beyond doubt and let the bond hold, to surrender to the connection that had been building. Despite danger, despite fear, despite half-truths, and I tried to read him, to understand the subtle signals, the pauses, the tilt of his head, the shift in his stance, but the uncertainty gnawed at me, threading through every thought, every breath, every glance, and I realized that the forest, the river, the night, and the shadows themselves seemed to conspire to test the bond, to push me toward decisions I was not ready to make, to force me to confront trust in its rawest, most dangerous form. And as we paused by a clearing, golden sunlight spilling across the ground, I noticed a figure in the distance, movement deliberate, calculated, and my pulse spiked, chest tightening as I recognized the subtle warning, the ripple of danger threading through the air. And he tensed immediately, body coiled, eyes scanning, and I wondered if he had known of the presence before I did, if he had led me here intentionally, and a chill ran through me at the thought, the notion that even his protective instincts could be intertwined with hidden agendas, and I realized that trust was no longer a choice but a battlefield, where every step, every glance, every shared secret could tip the balance between safety and peril, loyalty and betrayal, love and destruction, and my heart pounded with the awareness that our bond, strong as it was, rested on fragile threads that could snap under pressure, that the allure, the magnetic pull, the attraction that had bound me to him might also blind me to deception, and I questioned whether I truly knew him, or if I had only glimpsed pieces, fragments of the whole carefully revealed to draw me in. And the pup growled low, tail stiff, pressing closer as if sensing my inner conflict, and I felt a sudden weight in my chest, a tightening of fear, realization that the outside threats, the whispers in the shadows, the forces from his past, were not the only danger, that the possibility of betrayal within our bond, even accidental or unintended, now loomed as large, threatening to unravel everything, and I noticed his gaze flick toward the trees, a shadow crossing his golden eyes, and I wondered if he too wrestled with trust, if the bond we shared was layered with deception, half-truths, secrets kept for protection or for power, and I realized that the delicate balance between closeness and distance, intimacy and caution, was now the defining factor in every interaction, every heartbeat, every shared glance, and the forest seemed to thrum with awareness, acknowledging the tension, feeding it, amplifying it, until I felt as if every leaf, every whisper of wind, every ripple in the river carried judgment, expectation and warning, and I knew with absolute clarity that I had to choose carefully, that every gesture, every word, every decision would shape the bond, the trust, the connection, and yet the uncertainty gnawed at me, the possibility of betrayal festering in the back of my mind, planting seeds of doubt that could grow into a chasm if left unchecked, and I felt my hands tremble, heart racing as he extended a hand, golden eyes softening for a fraction of a second, a gesture of trust, of connection, of promise, and yet even as I reached for it, every instinct warned that the gesture could be layered with intent I could not yet perceive, and I realized that the choice of trust was no longer simple, no longer innocent, that the bond we shared was tested by forces both external and internal, by secrets, by legacy, by prophecy, by danger, and by the fragile human desire to believe in connection, and I stepped forward. Slowly, pulse hammering, pup at my side, chest tight with awareness, knowing that every movement mattered, that every choice mattered, and yet I could not deny the pull, the attraction, the magnetic draw that had been threading through us from the very beginning, even as suspicion festered like a shadow over the connection, leaving me trembling, breathless, and painfully aware that the next moments would define whether trust would hold or fracture under the weight of hidden truths and unspoken dangers. The sun had barely kissed the horizon when the tension in the forest thickened, shadows stretching long and sharp across the ground, twisting as if alive, and I felt the pup press against my leg, tail stiff, ears flat, growling low as if sensing the danger that had slipped from whispers and hints into unmistakable presence, and the air carried a scent I could not name, sharp, predatory, an invisible weight pressing against my chest and stomach, tightening with each heartbeat, making every step forward feel measured, deliberate, impossible to ignore, and I realized with a jolt that the threats that had once lurked in the periphery were now moving openly, deliberately, showing themselves with intent and calculation, as if daring me to react, to falter, to reveal weakness, and the Alpha King, walking ahead with the magnetic presence that had always both enthralled and terrified me, paused abruptly, golden eyes narrowing, muscles coiled, his body shifting with tension that made my skin prickle, and I felt the pull of attraction twist with fear, a mixture of draw and dread that left me unsteady, yet every instinct screamed to stay close, to follow, to heed his strength and protection, and the pup whimpered softly, pressing closer, nudging my hand as if reminding me to remain vigilant, aware, alive to the threats encroaching, and then movement, sudden and deliberate, flared from the trees at the edge of the clearing, figures stepping out from shadow into the dim light, faces partially obscured but eyes sharp, dangerous, calculating, and a shiver ran down my spine as I recognized the subtle cues, the posture, the confidence of predators who knew their advantage, and my chest tightened, pulse racing, every nerve alive, my mind spinning with the realization that the danger was immediate, deliberate, no longer distant or abstract, and he growled low, a sound vibrating in the air, alerting me to his awareness, to the shifting balance, to the invisible lines being drawn in the forest that marked territory, intent and confrontation, and I realized that our bond, fragile and powerful, would now be tested by forces intent on destruction, that the threads of attraction, trust, and legacy were interwoven with peril that demanded focus, courage, and awareness beyond anything I had yet experienced, and as I watched the figures move, subtle shifts of shadow revealing speed, strength and intent, I felt my stomach twist, knowing that even the pup and I, small and human, were targets in a game far larger, far more dangerous, than we could control, and I remembered the fragments of prophecy, the revelation of my bloodline, the weight of legacy threading through every moment of attraction and danger, and I felt a cold wave of fear as I realized that enemies sought to manipulate, to strike, to use the bond between us to their advantage, and that my presence here, tied to him, marked me as part of the stakes, part of the battlefield, a living threat in forces far beyond ordinary understanding, and the forest seemed to pulse with awareness, branches swaying unnaturally, leaves trembling, shadows shifting like liquid intent, echoing the threat that surrounded us, heightening every heartbeat, every breath, every sensation, until I felt as if the air itself were conspiring to press me toward a choice I had not yet realized, and the Alpha King moved closer, a predator poised with control, golden eyes blazing, muscles taut, and I felt the magnetic pull of attraction twist again with dread, tension, and awareness that the connection between us now carried risk beyond emotional or instinctual desire, that it was entwined with strategy, survival, and danger, and the pup yipped sharply, pressing between my legs, nudging me to stay low, stay quiet, stay alert, and I realized that the threat was closing in not only from the shadows but through the forest itself, every movement, every rustle, every subtle flicker of light indicating forces I could not fully understand, shaping our path, our choices, our survival, and I felt my legs stiffen. Chest tight, awareness hyper-focused on every detail, every sound, every movement, knowing that any misstep could expose me, could expose him, could alter the delicate balance of power and protection that had held until now, and as the figures advanced, subtle but deliberate, I felt a sudden surge of panic, the realization that we were being funneled, drawn into a position with fewer options, fewer escape routes, every step monitored, every line of sight calculated, and I understood with a jolt that we were being forced into a corner, that the shadows themselves were being used as weapons, and that strategy, instinct, and power would be tested to their limits, and the Alpha King growled again, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo through the trees, through the wind, through the very air. Yet even as he braced for confrontation, I felt the pull of connection, the magnetic attraction twisting with fear, a reminder that even amid danger, the bond between us could not be denied, could not be ignored, could not be set aside, and I realized that the threads that had drawn us together were now tangled with survival, with strategy, with peril, a web I could neither fully control nor escape, and the pup whimpered again, pressed against my chest, eyes wide, sensing the gravity of the moment, the sharp focus of predators, the narrowing options, and I felt my pulse spike, chest tight, stomach twisting, every nerve alive, as the figures emerged further from the shadows, moving with precision, coordination, and menace, aware of us, aware of the power at our side, and I felt a shiver that combined fear, anticipation, and the magnetic pull that had first drawn me to him, knowing that the next moments would define everything, that survival, trust, attraction, and danger were now inseparably linked, that the bond we had built would be tested, perhaps broken, and that the shadows closing in were more than physical, they were strategic, intentional, a calculated pressure that left me breathless, unsteady, aware that escape, defense, and protection were all in delicate balance. And as he shifted his stance, muscles coiled, golden eyes blazing with alertness and awareness, and the pup pressed closer, whimpering, tail stiff, I realized fully and terrifyingly that we had been driven into a corner, that there was no more distance to gain, no room to maneuver, no safety outside the pressure of the encroaching threat, and I felt my knees weaken, chest tighten, breath caught in my throat as the gravity of our position settled over me, the forest alive with energy, the enemies deliberate, the danger undeniable, and I understood that the next heartbeat, the next movement, the next choice would define whether we could survive, whether trust, bond, and attraction could endure, and whether the shadows closing in would consume us entirely. The forest seemed to hold its breath around us as we stood close, the Alpha King's golden eyes locking with mine, every heartbeat hammering like a drum in the silence, muscles taut, body coiled like a spring, and I felt the magnetic pull between us intensify until it was a physical ache, a fire that licked through my chest, igniting nerves I could not tame, and the pup whimpered softly, tail stiff, pressing against my leg as if sensing the storm of emotion swirling between us, and yet even with danger pressing from all sides, even with the shadows of enemies closing in, even with the weight of prophecy and bloodline anchoring me to forces I could scarcely comprehend, I found my gaze unable to leave him, drawn to the curve of his jaw, the glint of strength in his eyes, the way his presence seemed to bend the air, command the forest, call the energy around us into a tangible tension, a force that wrapped around my senses and refused to let go, and every instinct screamed that surrendering to this pull was reckless, yet impossible to resist, and I felt my fingers brush against his hand almost by accident, a spark firing through me that made my knees weak, chest tighten, breath catch, and he leaned closer, golden eyes softening for the briefest fraction of a second, a predator poised and human at once, a force of nature and a man whose magnetic pull defied logic, and the energy between us thickened until the world seemed to narrow to the space that separated us, to the heat that radiated from him, to the unspoken understanding that even in the shadow of danger, even with enemies watching, even with prophecy threading through my veins, desire had no boundaries, no hesitation, and I felt my lips part, pulse racing, every nerve alive, heart hammering, breath shallow, aware that every moment we lingered, every second of closeness, pulled us deeper into a forbidden territory, a place where attraction and danger merged into a single, undeniable force, and I could feel the brush of his hand against mine, deliberate yet cautious, a declaration and a question all at once, and I leaned into the warmth, drawn as if by gravity, sensing the power that rippled beneath his skin, the coiled strength, the duality of predator and protector, human and force beyond understanding, and I felt my chest ache with the tension, the desire, the pull that had been building since the river, since the first glance, since the magnetic moments that had threaded our lives together, and even as I leaned closer, daring to meet his gaze, daring to surrender in small measures to the magnetic attraction, a shiver ran through me at the awareness that the outside world had not paused, that shadows lingered at the edges of the forest, that enemies unseen but present were circling, waiting, watching, testing, calculating. Yet the pull between us refused to be ignored, a current stronger than fear, stronger than logic, stronger than caution, drawing me into the orbit of golden eyes that seemed to see every thought, every heartbeat, every fear, every longing, and I felt myself trembling, lips barely brushing his as our breaths mingled, warmth against warmth, pulse against pulse, a moment suspended between worlds, human and supernatural, desire and danger, and I sensed the coiling energy in him, the tension of power restrained, the restraint of predator who could devour the world yet chose to linger here, near me, and I realized with awe and fear that the attraction was no longer subtle, it was a force of its own, commanding, urgent, impossible to deny, and I leaned closer, heart hammering, breath shallow, every nerve alight, and his hand cupped my cheek, firm yet gentle, thumb brushing along the edge of my jaw, eyes locking with mine in a gaze that burned through the forest, through time, through the layers of danger and prophecy, and I felt the heat between us intensify, desire and forbidden attraction threading together, magnetic and undeniable, a force that pressed against reason and fear alike, drawing me forward, closer, to the point where hesitation seemed impossible, and yet even as I leaned in, even as the air around us shimmered with tension, even as the pull of attraction threatened to consume every thought and sensation, a sound shattered the fragile bubble of intimacy, a rustle sharper than wind, a snap of twig, a presence that was sudden, immediate and undeniable, and I froze, pulse spiking, breath catching, senses screaming that danger was not distant, that the shadows we had felt before were now here, tangible, encroaching, and he stiffened instantly, body coiled, golden eyes blazing with alertness, and I felt the magnetic tension twist into sharp awareness, desire battling survival instincts, attraction and fear interwoven in every heartbeat, and the pup yipped sharply, pressing against my chest, tail stiff, ears flat, sensing the threat, and I realized with a jolt that the moment, the forbidden closeness, had been interrupted, that whatever had been circling us had chosen this instant to reveal its presence, and I felt my heart hammer in my chest, breath shallow, hands trembling, chest tight with a mixture of longing and fear, as he moved instinctively between me and the direction of the sound, body a protective shield, muscles coiled, golden eyes scanning, every sense flaring, and I understood fully that the magnetic pull that had brought us together, the forbidden attraction that had ignited every nerve, would now have to share space with immediate danger, and the forest itself seemed to tense, the shadows folding and shifting with intent, every movement around us alive with anticipation, and I realized that this interruption was no accident, that the forces surrounding us had timed their approach, their observation, to test, to provoke, to challenge, and I felt a shiver of exhilaration and terror course through me, desire still throbbing, pulse racing, yet overshadowed by the awareness that the forbidden moment we had almost shared had been cut short by unseen hands, unseen eyes, unseen intent, and I felt the tension in the air as sharp as steel, the pull between us suspended, unresolved, urgent, and I realized that nothing would be the same, that the magnetism, the desire, The intensity would now carry the weight of imminent threat, and as I clutched the pup to my chest, feeling his small body tremble against mine, I sensed him beside me, his presence radiating power, strength, and magnetic pull, golden eyes blazing as he read the forest, the shadows, the unseen threat approaching, muscles coiled, and I knew that in the next heartbeat, the forest, the threat, and the forbidden passion we had almost indulged would collide, leaving me breathless, heart hammering, and trapped in a moment suspended between danger and desire, attraction and fear, a heartbeat away from consequences I could not yet predict, a cliffhanger that left every nerve alive, every sense electrified, every heartbeat pounding in anticipation. The air was electric with tension as the forest seemed to close in around us, shadows twisting unnaturally as if alive. The pup pressed against my legs, trembling with every crack of a branch underfoot, and I could feel the magnetic pull of him beside me, the alpha king, taut and coiled like a predator on the brink, golden eyes blazing with a mixture of anger, fear, and fierce protectiveness. Yet even as he moved to shield me, a figure emerged from the shadows, deliberate and threatening, eyes glinting with malice, and my chest tightened as I realized that the enemy we had sensed, the threat that had been stalking us in silence, had chosen this moment to strike, and everything erupted in chaos, branches snapping, leaves scattering, the pup barking and growling as instincts screamed at all of us to flee or fight, and I watched as the Alpha King moved with predatory precision, strength and speed beyond human comprehension, confronting the assailant with a roar that echoed through the forest, vibrating through my chest. And yet even as the confrontation unfolded, I sensed the rift growing between us, subtle at first, a glance that lingered too long, a gesture misread, a hesitation that carried weight, and I felt my stomach twist as fragments of mistrust and fear surfaced. The realization that even our bond, magnetic and deep as it was, could not fully shield us from misunderstanding and the shadows that pressed in from outside and inside, and the enemy struck with cunning and force, a calculated assault that tested every reflex, every instinct, every ounce of skill, and I watched him take blows I could not see coming, hear threats I could not interpret, and I felt the weight of helplessness crush my chest as my hands trembled, unable to intervene fully, feeling my heart pulled between attraction and fear, trust and doubt, love and instinct to protect. And then words, sharp and cutting, flew like blades, accusations whispered through the chaos, half-truths and manipulation threading into the fight, and I froze as the Alpha King's gaze flicked to me with a question, an unspoken demand, and I realized that even our magnetic connection was under siege, that the stress, the danger, the interference of enemies was bending every bond, twisting every intention, and I felt a shiver of panic as I struggled to reconcile my desire to trust with the evidence of deceit, misdirection, and the strategic cruelty of those who sought to exploit us, and I saw the figure I had believed in hesitate, flash of vulnerability, yet tempered by pride and instinct, and I felt the pull of forbidden attraction waver as my mind wrestled with fear and confusion, and then the enemy pressed harder, forceful and unrelenting, and in the struggle, in the chaos, the Alpha King made a choice that fractured the fragile equilibrium, striking decisively, yet in doing so leaving a rift, a moment of pain, a wedge of misunderstanding that I could not bridge in time, and I felt my chest tighten, heart pounding, as the golden eyes that had always drawn me now reflected something I had never seen, a mixture of fury, regret, and distance, and the pup whimpered at the tension, sensing the emotional fracture as keenly as the physical danger, and I realized that even as he fought to protect me, the bond we had nurtured, the magnetic attraction, the trust we had built, was splintering. Under pressure, influenced by danger, pride, and secrets that refused to stay buried, and every instinct told me that the distance between us was growing, that the moment of intimacy and connection we had cherished was being replaced by conflict, suspicion, and pain, and I felt tears sting my eyes as I watched him recoil from my gaze, the protective stance replaced with a hardness that pierced deeper than any blade, and I understood fully that our bond, powerful as it was, could be tested beyond endurance, that the pull of attraction, the legacy of blood, the magnetic connection threading through our lives, could be threatened by outside forces and the choices they forced upon us, and I felt my hands clench, knuckles white, heart racing, mind spinning with doubt and fear, and the enemy moved with relentless precision, forcing every action, every choice, every emotion into sharp relief, and I sensed that the confrontation would not end without loss, without sacrifice, without a fracture that would leave wounds invisible yet deep, cutting through trust, connection, and desire alike, and I watched helplessly as a series of rapid movements, decisions, and instinctive reactions created a chasm between us, each step taken in defense, each blow exchanged, each moment of hesitation widening the space that neither words nor touches could bridge, and I felt a cry rising in my chest, a need to reach, to repair, to demand understanding. Yet the force of events carried us further apart, and the pup whimpered again, tail stiff, ears flat, pressed between us, and I realized with a pang that even his instincts recognized the fracture, the loss of harmony, the distance that now threaded through every glance and gesture, and I watched the Alpha King move with precise ferocity, striking to protect, yet in doing so inadvertently pushing me away, the magnetic pull we had shared disrupted by fear, strategy, and misunderstanding, and I felt tears stream as I realized that the bond, as magnetic and intense as it had been, had reached a breaking point, a moment where trust could not hold against the pressure of danger, betrayal, and circumstance, and I felt my heart wrench, chest tight, every nerve alight with loss as he stepped back, eyes flashing golden with emotion I could not read, and I understood fully that this was the separation I had feared, painful, inevitable, and necessary, a moment of distance forged by conflict that left us trembling, shaken, questioning every intention, every feeling, every choice, and I felt the pup press desperately against me, sensing the emotional rift, and I realized that the Alpha King, even as he fought for survival, for me, for the bond we had nurtured, had been forced to create space, to withdraw, to protect both of us by stepping away, and I felt a sob rise in my throat as I watched him recede into the shadows, strength intact yet presence distant, leaving me trembling, heart pounding, chest tight with the ache of loss, staring after him as the forest held its breath, and I realized that this was the painful separation, the fracture that would test every emotion, every instinct, every connection we had, leaving me alone with the aftermath of conflict, with doubt, with fear, with the bitter weight of love and attraction interrupted by forces beyond control, and I sank to my knees, pup pressed close, body shaking, aware that the breaking point had arrived, that the bond we had shared was under threat, and that the forest, the enemies, the prophecy, and the magnetic pull between us would now demand endurance, courage, and patience. If anything could ever be mended, darkness closed in around me as I stumbled through the forest, the weight of separation pressing down on my chest, each step heavy with exhaustion and fear, the pup clinging to my side trembling with the same dread that had rooted itself in my heart, and the events of the breaking point replayed in my mind, every flash of golden eyes, every word left unspoken, every move that had driven a wedge between us cutting deeper than any wound, and I felt a shiver run through me as branches scraped against my arms, roots threatening to trip me, the forest itself seeming alive with menace, as if it were aware of my vulnerability, and the pull of the unknown pressed in from all sides, shadows stretching, shifting, whispering threats I could not name, and I realized fully that I was alone in a world that had been dangerous before but now felt utterly hostile, the absence of the Alpha King magnifying every sense of peril, making the air thick, the night oppressive, and yet I had no choice but to move forward, guided only by instinct, fear, and the faint memory of his presence, the magnetic pull that had drawn me once still lingering like a phantom at the edges of my mind, urging me to survive, to endure, to hope even when hope seemed impossible, and the pup whimpered softly, pressing closer, as if sharing in my terror while providing the smallest measure of comfort, reminding me that even in darkness, I was not entirely without connection, and I pressed on through brambles and underbrush, every sound amplified, every rustle, every snap of a twig sending my pulse racing, and I felt the memory of the forest at the river return to me, the moment when fate first touched my life, when my actions had shifted the course of destiny, and I realized that even in despair, even when the weight of separation threatened to crush me, I carried within me the spark of courage, of choice, of legacy, of bloodline that demanded I act, that demanded I survive, that demanded I confront the danger rather than succumb to fear, and the shadows themselves seemed to pulse with awareness, the wind stirring in patterns that made me shiver, the trees whispering secrets I could almost understand, fragments of warnings, fragments of guidance, as if the forest itself were testing me, daring me to falter or to rise, and I felt my hands tremble, eyes scanning the darkness, searching for anything that could offer direction, and I stumbled across a faint marking on a tree, a symbol etched deep into the bark, unfamiliar yet resonating with something buried in my memory, something instinctual, a sign that perhaps I was not entirely alone, that forces beyond comprehension were nudging me forward, guiding me, and my heart fluttered with the faintest spark of hope, fragile and delicate yet undeniable, reminding me that even in the abyss light could exist, that even in the absence of his presence clues, guidance, and destiny could converge to point a way forward. And I crouched briefly to inspect the symbol, pup nuzzling my hand, sensing my cautious optimism, the marking itself a complex weave of lines and curves, subtle but precise, almost like a map or a code, and I felt my mind race, trying to decipher, trying to understand, trying to find a thread to follow, a path that could lead me back to him, to truth, to connection, to the magnetic bond we shared that had been torn but not severed. And the forest seemed to shift as if acknowledging my awareness, shadows retreating slightly, the wind calming, leaves brushing against one another, with a softer, almost encouraging sound, and I realized that while danger surrounded me, while my body ached, while fear clawed at every nerve, I had stumbled upon a sign that could serve as a guide, a faint whisper of clarity in the suffocating darkness, and I felt a pulse of determination ignite within me, fragile yet insistent, that I could not let despair define me, that I could not allow fear to dictate my choices, that I had to fight for truth, for connection, for the bond that had been forged in fire and attraction, for the legacy that flowed through my bloodline. And even as I pressed forward, aware that each step might bring new peril, new threats, new forces seeking to exploit my vulnerability, I felt the spark of hope grow, subtle but persistent, threading through my mind, through my heart, through my very senses, reminding me that even in the abyss, there was direction, purpose, and the possibility of reunion. And I held the pup close, whispering soft encouragements that barely carried over the wind, feeling his small body quiver yet resilient, and I realized that the bond one shared with him, magnetic and dangerous as it was, had prepared me for moments like this, that every pull, every glance, every subtle warning, every fragment of prophecy had strengthened my instincts, my courage, my awareness, and that even now in isolation, in danger, in despair, I was capable of navigating, of surviving, of following the faint spark toward a path that could lead me back to truth, back to him, back to the bond that had been fractured but not destroyed. And I felt my legs move with purpose, muscles tense, senses alert, scanning the darkness for movement, for signs, for anything that could confirm the path. And then a faint glow caught my eye, subtle and distant, barely perceptible through the dense forest, yet unmistakable, a soft light that pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat, and I felt a shiver of recognition, a whisper of intuition, that this was more than coincidence, that this glow, this signal was a cryptic clue, a breadcrumb in the darkness left perhaps by forces I could not yet name, or by him, or by destiny itself, urging me onward, and my chest swelled with a mixture of relief, fear, and anticipation, for even though the abyss pressed around me, even though danger loomed, even though isolation threatened to crush my spirit, I had a reason to continue, a direction to follow, and a faint spark of hope glimmered in the depths of despair. Fragile, luminous, and insistent, threading through every nerve, every heartbeat, every breath, whispering that the path was not lost, that connection, truth, and survival were within reach if I had the courage to follow. And I took a deep, steadying breath, pup nudging my hand as if to echo my resolve, and I stepped forward, aware that the journey through the abyss had only begun, that every shadow might conceal danger, that every step demanded vigilance. Yet knowing that even in this darkness, even in this trial, the faint spark of hope and the cryptic clue before me could guide me toward the light, toward reunion, toward the truth that had been obscured, and with trembling hands but a determined heart, I moved into the darkness, carrying the fragile flame of possibility with me, ready to face whatever awaited, trusting that even the abyss could not extinguish the spark that would guide me home. The moon hung low over the forest, silver light spilling through the dense canopy, painting everything in a spectral glow, and I moved cautiously, each step careful, senses heightened, pulse thundering in my chest, the pup at my side trembling yet resolute, tail low, ears alert, whispering instinctively that danger was near even as hope and anticipation mingled in the hollow of my heart. And then movement ahead, subtle, deliberate, caught my eye, and I froze, breath caught, heart leaping as recognition surged like electricity through every nerve, for there, emerging from the shadows, was the Alpha King. His golden eyes scanning, body coiled, muscles taut and controlled, yet I could feel the tension, the restrained emotion in every motion, the unspoken pain of separation etched in the lines of his face, and I felt a surge of longing I could scarcely contain, an ache that had been building through every lonely night, every fearful step, every shadowed moment since our parting, And yet even as I stepped forward, drawn by the magnetic force that had bound us from the river onward, I felt the weight of mistrust, the fractures left by conflict, betrayal, and danger pressing against my chest, twisting my thoughts, clouding every instinct. And he took a step toward me, cautious eyes flicking with both recognition and guarded hesitation. And I realized fully that the reunion we had both longed for would not be gentle, that the magnetic pull between us was tempered by the scars of recent events, by the choices that had driven wedges between us, and yet the force was undeniable, drawing me closer despite fear, despite doubt, despite the knowledge that every step carried risk, that every heartbeat could be misinterpreted, that every glance could ignite old wounds. And I felt my pulse spike as the pup pressed between us, sensing the tension, sensing the emotions that twisted through the air like electric currents, sensing the pull that refused to be denied. And our eyes met, locking in a gaze that carried months of longing, fear, pain, and magnetic attraction. And I shivered as I realized that the bond we shared had not been severed, that the threads of connection, attraction, and destiny were still woven between us, taut yet resilient. And I could feel the heat of his presence even at this cautious distance, the strength, the coiled power, the unyielding magnetic force that had drawn me since the river. And I swallowed, chest tight, throat dry, every nerve alight as he finally took another step forward, deliberate, controlled, and I mirrored him, instinct and desire guiding me, yet every part of me wary, aware of danger, aware of mistrust, aware of the delicate balance we now navigated. And the pup whimpered softly, pressing against my leg, grounding me, reminding me that even in this charged moment, vigilance was necessary. Yet even as my mind raced with caution, my heart could not deny the pull, the ache, the need for connection, for reconciliation, for acknowledgement of what had been lost and what could still be reclaimed. And I saw him hesitate, golden eyes scanning mine, lips tight, jaw firm. Yet something softened. Flicker of recognition, of longing, of unspoken apology threading through the fierce protectiveness that had always defined him. And I felt tears prick at my eyes as emotions surged, grief for lost time, fear of repetition, and a longing that defied logic. Yet I held my stance, aware that our reunion demanded more than surrender, demanded clarity, demanded acknowledgement of the dangers, the betrayals, the fractures that lingered. And I could feel the tension ripple between us, a current of desire and caution, love and mistrust, attraction and wariness, pulling us into an orbit neither of us could fully resist. And he took a knee slightly, not in submission, not in humility, but a gesture of alignment, of acknowledgement, a way to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. And I felt my chest tighten, breath catching, sensing the depth of intention, the gravity of the moment. And I stepped closer, drawn by instinct, by magnetic force, by the remnants of the bond that had survived months of fear and separation. And when our hands finally brushed, tentative, exploratory, electricity surged, pulse against pulse, nerves igniting. And I realized that even in the shadow of mistrust, even in the presence of danger, even with the world pressing against us, the attraction, the connection, the magnetic force was unbreakable, unyielding, undeniable, threading through every glance, every breath, every heartbeat. And he spoke softly, voice low, steady yet strained, words that carried weight, intention, and vulnerability. And I felt the pull of emotion twist with relief, desire, and fear as the past and present collided in the magnetic intensity of proximity. And I saw the ghost of a smile flicker, rare and fleeting, yet warm and charged with meaning, as he met my gaze fully. And I realized that in this moment, suspended between fear and longing, mistrust and connection, danger and desire, we were both aware that what had been broken could be rebuilt, that what had been tested could be strengthened, that our bond, fragile and magnetic, could endure if nurtured with intention, courage, and trust. And the pup yipped softly, nudging between us, a reminder that connection persisted even amid tension and uncertainty. And I felt a spark of determination ignite, fragile yet potent, that we could forge a path through the shadows together, that we could reclaim the intimacy and trust that had been fractured. And I stepped fully into the space between us, heart hammering, chest tight, senses alight with the magnetic pull that had drawn us since the river. And I saw him extend his hand. Deliberately, a gesture both protective and inviting. And I hesitated, aware of the history, aware of the dangers, aware of the magnetic attraction that had never waned. Yet instinct and desire overrode doubt. And I placed my hand in his, pulse against pulse, fingers entwining. And the current that surged through me made every nerve stand on end, breath caught, heart racing. And I realized that this reunion, though fraught with mistrust, emotion, and danger, was the beginning of a new understanding, a fragile yet undeniable pact that acknowledged our bond, our attraction, our mutual desire to survive, to trust, to reclaim what had been fractured. And he spoke again, low and deliberate, words carrying weight, resonance, and promise, a vow that neither of us would forget the lessons of the past, that neither of us would allow fear or outside forces to sever the magnetic bond threading through our lives. And I nodded, voice trembling but resolute, a secret pact forming between us, fragile yet binding, a commitment to navigate the shadows together, to protect, to trust, to endure. And as we stood, hands entwined, eyes locked, the forest around us seeming to exhale, shadows folding back slightly, wind softening, the pup nestled between us, I realized that even amid scars, mistrust, and danger, the magnetic pull, the forbidden attraction, and the unbreakable bond had survived. And in that moment, beneath the silver glow of the moon, we made a silent vow, a secret pact, a promise that whatever darkness lay ahead, whatever threats and trials awaited, we would face them together, guided by the spark that had drawn us from the river, tempered by the fires of separation, strengthened by the magnetic force that bound us. And I felt a tremor of hope thread through the tension, fragile, insistent, undeniable, a promise of reunion, survival, and the power of connection that even shadows could not obscure. The night pressed down like a living weight, shadows thick and restless beneath the silver light of the moon, and I felt every nerve in my body tingle with anticipation and dread. Pup pressed close, tail stiff, ears flat against the skull, sensing the imminence of danger that twisted through the air like a living thing, while beside me, the Alpha King moved with coiled precision, golden eyes scanning every shadow, muscles taut beneath fur and clothing, every movement deliberate and loaded with the quiet intensity of a predator who knew the terrain as well as he knew the hearts around him. And I realized fully that the final hunt had begun, that the enemy who had haunted every step, every shadow, every breath since the river had risen, more cunning, more vicious, more relentless than anything we had encountered. And the forest seemed to pulse with malevolence, as though it too understood the stakes, whispering warnings through rustling leaves and shifting branches, yet offering no path but forward. And I felt my chest tighten with the weight of everything riding on this moment, the bond between us tested, the magnetic attraction strained under the pressure of destiny, prophecy, and peril, and every instinct screamed that failure was not an option, that the lives around us, the legacy we carried, and the bond that had been forged in fire and longing were balanced on the edge of a knife. And as the wind carried the faintest scent of our adversary, a mixture of iron, earth, and something darker, I felt a shiver run through me, simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, for I knew that the coming confrontation would demand courage beyond my imagining, instincts honed sharper than any blade, and a heart capable of trusting when trust felt impossible. And the Alpha King glanced at me, golden eyes meeting mine, and in that gaze, I felt both the magnetic pull that had drawn me to him and the full weight of responsibility, of danger, of the inevitability of facing the ultimate trial. And I felt my stomach tighten, knowing that every choice we made in the next moments could tip the balance between survival and annihilation, between love preserved and bond severed, between destiny fulfilled and shattered. And we pressed forward together, each step measured, every sense alight, shadows seeming to twist with intent, the pup yipping softly yet courageously at our heels. And I felt the pulse of the forest, the rhythm of unseen creatures, the echo of power in every rustle. And I knew that this hunt was not simply physical, it was spiritual, emotional, predestined, a collision of forces that demanded we rise to meet them with all we were. And I felt my fingers brush against his, a fleeting touch that grounded me, reminded me of the bond, the magnetic attraction, the love that had been tempered in fire and distance, a tether against the darkness that sought to consume us. And then movement flickered in the periphery, subtle, deliberate, and I knew the enemy had arrived, cloaked in shadows, silent yet radiating threat, presence so powerful that even the forest seemed to recoil. And the Alpha King shifted, stance widening, eyes narrowing, muscles coiled, body radiating the duality of man and predator. And I felt my pulse spike, knowing that the final confrontation was no longer distant, that we were moments from the reckoning, and every instinct sharpened, every breath measured, every heartbeat synchronizing with the tension in the air. And I realized that this was the culmination of every choice, every risk, every spark of connection that had led us here, that the forces of love, loyalty, and destiny would all be tested simultaneously. And I felt my chest tighten as fear, anticipation, and desire wove into a single, overwhelming current, pulling me forward despite every instinct urging caution, and then a figure emerged fully from the darkness, imposing, dangerous, the culmination of months of threat, every motion calculated, every glance a challenge, and I realized with a jolt that this enemy, this ultimate adversary, embodied the very forces we had been contending with all along: betrayal, vengeance, hunger for power, and the will to destroy what we held dear. And I felt my hands clench, muscles tense, chest tight as the pup whimpered against my leg, and the Alpha King growled low in his throat, a sound vibrating through the forest, warning, challenge, and promise all at once, and I understood fully that there was no turning back, that retreat was impossible, that the only path lay forward, through danger, through fear, through fire, through the ultimate test, and I felt a surge of adrenaline, terror interlaced with courage, pulling me upright, heart hammering, nerves taut, senses ignited, ready to face whatever storm this adversary would unleash, knowing that every action, every decision, every flicker of instinct could determine the outcome. And I felt the magnetic pull of the Alpha King beside me, strength radiating, presence overwhelming, and I understood that we were bound together in this, our bond, our love, our mutual trust, now essential weapons in a war that demanded both courage and precision. And the enemy advanced, silent and deliberate, shadows folding and shifting around them, and I felt the tension coil in my chest like a spring ready to release, pulse racing, breath measured yet shallow with anticipation, as we readied ourselves, senses alight, muscles primed, hearts aligned, knowing that the final hunt was upon us, that everything we had endured, every moment of separation, every trial, every magnetic spark of attraction, every instinct honed, would culminate in the coming moments, and the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, as though awaiting the clash, the reckoning, the testing of destiny. And I felt my heart swell with a mixture of fear, love, and determination, knowing that whatever the outcome, we would meet it together, bonded by force and choice, love and destiny. And as the enemy closed the distance, presence radiating threat, danger, and power, I stepped forward, pup clinging to my side, senses sharpened, body coiled, heart pounding, and I knew that the greatest trial of our lives was about to begin, the final hunt where love, loyalty, and destiny would be tested to their fullest. And with a deep, steadying breath, I moved into the darkness, fully aware that the moment we had trained, feared, and longed for had arrived, the ultimate confrontation awaiting, every instinct, every choice, every heartbeat aligning toward survival, toward bond, toward destiny, toward the reckoning that would define everything we had fought for, everything we had endured, everything we had dared to desire. And I felt the magnetic pull of him at my side, golden eyes blazing, body coiled, presence overwhelming, and I knew we would face this together, walking into the abyss, hearts aligned, ready for the final hunt. The forest erupted around us in a storm of movement, shadows twisting violently under the silver light of the moon, leaves scattering like shards of glass, the air thick with tension, electricity, and the metallic tang of imminent danger, and I felt my heart hammer as the ultimate adversary advanced, every motion deliberate, powerful, predatory, eyes gleaming with a mix of malice and cunning. The pup pressed tightly against my side, whining yet brave, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding, while beside me, the Alpha King radiated controlled fury, muscles coiled, senses sharpened, golden eyes locking onto the enemy with the precision of a predator, and I realized fully that the culmination of months of fear, longing, and struggle had arrived, that destiny itself was converging on this singular moment, every choice, every instinct, every bond put to the ultimate test, and I felt my chest tighten as the enemy struck with lethal intent, movement rapid and precise, forcing us into defensive positions that demanded every ounce of courage, every shred of skill, and every pulse of instinct we possessed. And as I dodged, leapt, and pressed against the Alpha King, feeling the magnetic pull between us stronger than ever, I realized that love, trust, and survival had fused into a single force, driving me forward despite fear, despite pain, despite the knowledge that the outcome could claim everything I held dear. And then came the first strike that landed too close for comfort, a brush of danger that sent adrenaline surging through my veins, every nerve alight, muscles tensing, heart racing as the enemy advanced with relentless precision, testing our limits, our resolve, and I felt the Alpha King shift, countering with lethal grace, strength, and speed beyond human comprehension, the clash of power resonating through the trees, echoing through my body, and I realized that even as he fought, I too was called to act, to make choices that could save or doom, protect or lose, love or sacrifice. And the pup barked, snapping me from the blur of instinct to awareness, reminding me of what was at stake, of the innocence and bond that depended on our actions, and I surged forward, guided by adrenaline, love, and the magnetic force between us, weaving between shadows, striking where necessary, feeling the pulse of danger in every breath, every movement, and then the enemy revealed their true power, a surge of darkness that twisted the air, bending shadows into threatening forms, forcing both fear and awe to coil in my chest, and I felt a cry rise in my throat, not of panic but of determination, that we would not falter, that we would endure, that we would face destiny on our own terms. Yet even as we pressed, the cost became evident. Blows landed that tested our endurance, scratches, bruises, and moments where instinct alone saved us, and I saw the Alpha King falter slightly, golden eyes flicking to mine with unspoken apology and warning, a reminder that even the strongest could bleed, even the most controlled could be vulnerable, and I felt my own resolve sharpen, a decision forming in the core of my being, that I could not allow fear, pain, or hesitation to dictate the outcome, that sacrifice, courage, and love demanded action. And then came the moment where time seemed to stretch, every heartbeat magnified, every shadow dancing with menace, and I faced the enemy directly, pulse surging, muscles coiled, mind racing, aware that this choice, this strike, this instant could define everything, and I summoned every ounce of strength, every thread of instinct, every fragment of courage, and acted, moving with a clarity that was almost instinctive, a fusion of heart, mind, and magnetic connection with the Alpha King. And the clash was violent, precise, terrifying, yet necessary, echoes of impact reverberating through the forest, the pup barking, crouched, pressed against my side, and I realized that even as I fought, I was forced to make the most painful choice, a decision that demanded prioritizing the greater good, the survival of those I loved, the preservation of destiny over comfort, over instinct, over the immediate safety of my own heart, and I felt tears sting as the act unfolded, sacrifice mingling with courage, love mingling with anguish, the magnetic connection with the Alpha King, a tether that anchored me even as I stepped into the fear I had long dreaded, knowing that victory demanded cost, that the threads of destiny were woven through trial, suffering, and unwavering resolve, and the enemy faltered, recognizing our unity, our determination, our willingness to endure, and I pressed with every fiber of my being, the Alpha King beside me, golden eyes blazing, strength coiling, and together we forced the enemy back, shadows twisting and scattering as the force of our bond, skill and courage surged, and then with one final decisive act, the enemy was overcome, their power dissipating, presence fading, leaving silence heavy and profound in the wake of the storm, and I fell to my knees, chest heaving, pup clinging to me, body trembling with exhaustion, adrenaline, and relief, and the Alpha King knelt beside me, golden eyes softening, presence radiating warmth and reassurance. Yet I felt the echo of the cost, the sting of sacrifice, the weight of choices made, and I realized that even in victory, there was loss, a reshaping of hearts, a transformation forged in fire, shadows, and the ultimate confrontation, and I looked around at the forest, still trembling from the clash, sensing the lingering danger dissipating, yet aware that our lives would never be the same, that destiny had carved its mark into our souls, and I saw the Alpha King extend a hand, strength and gentleness intertwined, and I took it, feeling the magnetic pull stronger than ever, knowing that our bond had survived, tested, and emerged tempered and unbreakable. Yet I also felt the scar of the choices, the pain of the sacrifice, the echo of fear faced and conquered, and I understood fully that we had been transformed, changed, and forged anew by the ordeal, by the clash of forces, by love, loyalty, and destiny intertwined, and the pup barked softly, pressing against us, a reminder of innocence preserved, of life endured, of bonds reaffirmed, and I breathed deeply, chest rising and falling, aware that the immediate aftermath was a mixture of relief, grief, joy, and exhaustion, a moment suspended between the terror of the hunt and the promise of survival, of reconnection, of rebuilding, and I realized with a profound surge of clarity that even at destiny's edge, where fear, love, and choice converged, we had prevailed, yet not without transformation, not without sacrifice, not without the reminder that the path forward would demand vigilance, courage, and the unwavering strength of heart and bond. And as the forest exhaled, shadows folding back, wind softening, and moonlight bathing us in silver calm, I felt the first true sense of peace since the hunt began, knowing that we had faced the ultimate trial, confronted our deepest fears, acted with courage and love, and emerged victorious yet irrevocably changed, and with the pup at my side, the Alpha King beside me, golden eyes warm yet fierce, I understood that destiny had tested us, shaped us, and now awaited our next steps, and I breathed, steadying, feeling the weight of transformation settle, the echo of sacrifice lingering, and the first glimmer of a new chapter stretching ahead, forged in the fires of destiny's edge. The dawn broke over the forest with a soft, fragile light, filtering through the trees in golden shafts that danced across the moss and leaves, and I felt the weight of everything that had transpired settle into my chest, heavy yet tempered with a quiet clarity. The pup nestled between us, small and steadfast, a reminder of the innocence we had protected and the bonds we had forged in the fire of peril, while beside me, the Alpha King, moved with a grace tempered by both exhaustion and relief, his golden eyes meeting mine with a depth of emotion that no words could fully convey, and I realized with a shiver that the forest around us, once filled with threat and shadow, now seemed to exhale in acknowledgement of our endurance, of our triumph, yet also in recognition of the cost, the lives and moments lost, the fear endured, the sacrifices made, and I felt tears prick at my eyes as memories of the journey surged, flashes of danger, longing, separation, magnetic attraction, mistrust, forbidden moments, and the relentless pull that had carried us from the river to this fragile morning. And I sensed in him the same reflection, a quiet mourning for what had been endured and an acknowledgement of what had been gained, trust reforged, bonds strengthened, and love hardened into something eternal, something unbreakable yet tempered with the understanding that life could never return to what it had once been. And I felt my chest tighten with the mingling of relief and sorrow, joy and grief, knowing that the culmination of our trials had forged a connection deeper than anything I had imagined possible, yet also that the world we now inhabited demanded vigilance, courage, and the acceptance of change. And the pup barked softly, nudging against my hand, grounding me, reminding me of the simplicity of life that still persisted amid the complexity of our entwined fates. And I inhaled deeply, the air crisp with morning, carrying the scent of pine, earth, and dew, a grounding reminder of survival, of continuity, of the fragile beauty that existed even after darkness. And I felt the Alpha King shift beside me, his presence a steady warmth, magnetic and reassuring, a pulse that intertwined with mine, hearts aligned in rhythm, minds connected through unspoken understanding, and I realized fully that the bond we shared, forged in fire, shadow, and longing, had reached its ultimate form, no longer tentative, tested, or incomplete, but solid, eternal, resonant with the echoes of every choice, every trial, every brush with fear and longing that had defined our journey. And I saw the way he regarded me, a mix of reverence, desire, and unshakable commitment, golden eyes reflecting both the trials we had endured and the quiet promise of what we could now build together. And I felt a pulse of gratitude, fierce and humbling, for the love that had persisted, for the trust that had been restored, for the resilience we had discovered in each other. And yet even amid the triumph, I acknowledged the shadows that lingered, the memories of loss and fear, the weight of sacrifice that would never fully fade, shaping us, defining us, reminding us that every bond earned through peril was precious and fragile. And I felt the pup whine softly, tail wagging with tentative joy, pressing against our legs, a living symbol of continuity, hope, and the small victories that sustained life even in a world of darkness and uncertainty. And I realized that we had been transformed irrevocably, our hearts tempered in the crucible of trials, and the magnetic attraction that had drawn us from the river had matured into something broader, encompassing trust, loyalty, courage, and an understanding of the fragility and power of connection. And I felt the Alpha King reach for my hand, fingers entwining, pulse synchronizing, and in that simple touch, I sensed the culmination of everything we had endured, the totality of fear, love, longing, and survival compressed into a single heartbeat that resonated between us. And I knew that, whether the days ahead brought further trials, joys, or quiet moments, the bond we now shared would endure, eternal yet tempered, powerful yet respectful of the forces that had tested us. And I felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief, awe, and a haunting recognition that even in victory, the echoes of our journey would linger, shaping every step, every breath, every decision we would make from this day forward. And I allowed myself to exhale, slowly, deeply, feeling the tension drain, replaced by the warmth of connection, the quiet knowledge of survival, and the magnetic presence of the one who had been my anchor, my challenge, my passion, and my partner through every shadowed step. And I saw him nod subtly, a gesture of understanding, respect, and acknowledgement that the trials had ended yet the responsibility remained, that love was a choice forged in moments of fire and shadow, and I felt tears slip down, not of sorrow, not solely of relief, but of recognition, the deep, aching awareness that we had endured, survived, and emerged changed, stronger, connected beyond the bounds of ordinary existence. And I realized in that instant that every whispered warning, every magnetic pull, every shadowed encounter had led to this moment, this fragile dawn where everything hung balanced yet resolute, where the past existed in memory, the present in breath and heartbeat, and the future in potential and choice. And I looked to him fully, golden eyes locking with mine, and in that gaze I felt not only love but unshakable trust, not only passion but the weight of shared destiny, and I knew that the bond we had forged, tempered through peril and longing, could never be broken, that it would echo through time and memory, a resonance of courage, sacrifice, and unwavering connection. And I let the pup curl against my feet, feeling the heartbeat of life continuing, fragile yet resilient, and I realized that the echoes of all we had endured would linger, haunting, beautiful and transformative, imprinting us with the knowledge that love earned through trials, forged through danger, tested by destiny, was eternal. And I felt the Alpha King shift closer, hand still in mine, presence radiating calm, strength, and reassurance, and I knew with a profound, haunting clarity that we had survived not only the darkness without but the shadows within, and that even as the wind stirred the trees, sunlight breaking in gentle splendor, our bond had reached its ultimate, unbreakable form, magnetic, tested, eternal, carrying with it the echoes of fear faced, love claimed, trust earned, destiny met. And as I inhaled, chest rising with the crisp forest air, heart synchronized with his, pup nestled safely between us, I understood fully that this was the moment where everything changed forever, a quiet, haunting culmination of all we had endured, all we had risked, all we had dared to hope for. And in that suspended breath of dawn, I felt the permanence of our bond, the depth of the journey, the lingering echoes of trials past, and the enduring promise that whatever shadows lay ahead, we would face them together, tethered by love, courage, and the magnetic, eternal resonance of hearts forged in fire and darkness.